Thank you guys for coming. My name is Sarah Lang. I work at the Brattleboro Development Credit Corporation. I manage a project called the Southern Vermont Economy Project. It's funded by USDA Rural Development Grant. I want to thank, obviously, Bennington College for this beautiful room. We were going to be in the town of Shaftesbury, but clearly there was a lot of interest in this topic, and so we needed a bigger space. And then I also want to thank the town of Shaftesbury. They provided the tasty snacks and coffee. So if you see Tim, he was the one out at the table. Thank him for the snacks. A little bit of background on where this kind of came from. Probably back in, I think it was June or July, I had a town manager come to me and say, I would really love to get town leaders together and talk about economic development. Town managers deal with a lot of different topics, one of them being economic development. And so we started gathering these quarterly meetings to talk about the different, issues in rural towns in southern Vermont around economic development. And then they sort of expanded into kind of what you see now. We actually had one 3 months ago on connectivity, and we had about 35 people there. And now, we're here to talk about housing, and it's clearly an important issue and, really contributes to the economy. So the project that I run, like I said, is funded by the USDA. I work with partners in Bennington and Windham County to basically help increase capacity, create or initiate collaborations. And we've got a great group of, I think, 13 grant partners that we work with on a regular basis to provide any sort of information, trainings, workshops that they may need. So we're going to get started with the supply and demand, so talking about some data. We're going to have Peter from Wyndham Windsor come on up, give sort of the Wyndham side of things, and then we'll have Stephanie from Shires Housing to talk about the Bennington side.
Hi, everybody. I'm Peter Paggi. I'm the Director of Housing Development at the Wyndham and Windsor Housing Trust. And we'll talk a little bit about housing data in Windham County. Thank you. In Windham County, primarily in the Brattleboro area. That's where a lot of our market data comes from. But it's indicative of the general market area. So we'll get started and we have a little renter profile, and most of this data was taken from a recent market study we had done for a new project. So this data is recent as of 2 months ago. So in our market area, you can see here that we have kind of the different age groups in our households, and you can see the fastest growing is the elderly. We have decreases actually in every age group from 15 to 64, and then increases in the 65 and over category. And then in the renter households by size, this is another major thing we see. The largest renter households are 1 and 2 person households. So single people and small families are our biggest market right now, and that's pretty indicative in our latest developments also. We have one development going in right now that is all efficiencies. That's a little bit of a unique situation. It's also targeted mainly towards homeless individuals and providing services to those individuals. But our most recent development actually is majority efficiency and 1-bedroom households for general occupancy. And we were not necessarily taken aback, but we wanted to provide smaller units, but we were really surprised by the market study showing just how strong the need is for that population. And then this is our income also, which you can see. We do primarily tax credit development, so working with people who make generally around 60% of our area median income. And we are going up a little further into the 80% of area median income and a little higher to the 100 and 120%. But that 60% AMI is generally the tax credit limit for our developments. which is still a little higher than people would think. A lot of people think we serve, the most vulnerable, the most needy populations, but our income limits go into that $35,000 to $40,000 range, depending on household size. And you can see here in the income of in our market area for our latest project, which is Brattleboro and the surrounding areas, that almost or more than half are in that to up to $35,000 range. So there's a strong market need for income restricted affordable apartments, and that's proven by our market data. And yeah. And then the housing stock, which is the biggest. Now we're moving more into the demand. This is really the biggest squeeze we see. In Brattleboro, there is a 0.7% vacancy rate, which essentially means that the average apartment is vacant for 3 days or less out of the year, which is it's virtually impossible to find an apartment. Unless you know somebody or through private networks, which is how I found my previous apartments, how a lot of people find their apartments. And generally those apartments also are owned by private landlords. They're fine, but they're not the best. Some are definitely substandard. A lot of them are, like I said, at best fine. But the need for housing of any sort is pretty prevalent here, especially the need for kind of high-performance housing, really healthy housing. And that's evident in this slide, which shows the residential building permits, both in Brattleboro and in Windham County. So when we were doing this market study for Brattleboro, you can see here that there have been, since 2004, there have been 9 multifamily building permits issued. So there's not a lot of new construction rental housing happening. A lot of those building permits were also our housing. So there is a big squeeze on demand. There's not a lot being built. Obviously, as you get more into the greater Windham County area, the numbers go up a little bit. But even in the home ownership section, 132 new building permits. A lot of the housing stock that you're finding just, is our older houses. That's what's in Vermont. Were built using, old building science and just isn't really up to speed in terms of modern performance when you get into ventilation, indoor air quality. Kind of the thermal envelope energy usage. So we just end up with a lot of, I hate to say it, but substandard housing, especially in our rental markets.
Hey, Pete, just for the county broadly, what are you considering a building permit?
I believe it's a permit issued by the municipality, so a DRB approval.
For new construction?
For new construction, yeah. And then we also have the rents, which are another huge issue. As we saw in the previous slide, the largest household incomes for rental housing is in that up to $35,000 range. But you can see market rents are just increasing. And so in that $35,000 range, your affordable rent is going to be somewhere around the $600 mark. And we are, as you can see, even for the 0 and 1 bedrooms, well above that. So that means that our renters are cost burdened with their rent, and many of them are paying over that that 30% threshold of income, which is generally considered affordable. And even our lowest income renters are going just so far above and beyond that there's a great need there. And actually, so on our waiting list, this is also some interesting data I pulled from our property management. On our waiting list, 58% of our waiting list rents has an income below 30% of the area median income. And like I said, our tax credit rentals go up to 60% of area median income. So by the time we're getting up to there, we're at 8% of our waiting list has a median income between 50 and 60%. And that's kind of a perception issue, I think, in affordable housing. It's a marketing issue for our organization that we're trying to tackle, but it's also a perception issue in the greater community, that a lot of people think this housing isn't for them because it's subsidized or what have you. A lot of different thoughts around that. But our housing is unsubsidized, and it's affordable to people, like I said, making that $27,000 to $35,000 range, depending on their income. And that's actually the last slide of mine. But like I said, the biggest squeeze that we see is substandard housing, rents that are above the affordable limit of that 30% of income for our populations, and a population whose salaries are not increasing with rent. That is the biggest issue. And then part of what we try and do is to meet this demand, tackle the substandard housing issue by building what we consider, and I think what a lot of people might say are some of the best buildings in Brattleboro, in terms of both exterior aesthetics, as well as building quality, indoor air quality, thermal envelope, and energy usage. So that is what we're seeing in our organization. So, any questions on any of this data specifically, or anything related to kind of tax credit housing, or what would make how this could benefit other people? Yep.
You said earlier that since 2004, 9 multifamily building permits have been issued?
In Brattleboro, yes.
In Brattleboro
Yep.
specifically.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question on the rental numbers that you have posted up there. I presume those all were not inclusive of utilities, or how do you?
On this chart? Yeah, these are just the fair market rents. So yes, not including utilities. So that would be another cost associated with this. When we generate our rental schedules, we include a utility allowance. So we don't necessarily include utilities in the rent, but it's taken into account. A general idea of the utilities are taken into account when we form our rents.
Are these rents your rents, or is this the area?
No, these are the fair market rents in Windham County. So our tax credit rents, like I said, range anywhere, depending on unit size and household size, from about $450 a month upward. That would be for an efficiency, upwards to maybe $800 a month, $850 for a 3-bedroom house or a 3-bedroom apartment. So, and again, that's that. Interestingly, I was talking with our home ownership director. Like I said, a lot of people view this type of housing as, whatever you want to call it, subsidized housing, government housing, whatever. This is not. This can be a path for really any family towards just more affordable housing, which can lead towards savings for eventual home ownership, and just in general keeping bills in an affordable level and keeping that under control. So.
What are some of the barriers that you see to expanding housing stock in the area?
Well, from our perspective, a lot of what we see sometimes is, unfortunately, we haven't seen this in a while, but we have seen it quite a bit in the past, pushback from the community. Fortunately, I think we, in the Brattleboro area and in the surrounding towns, we've been pretty well received. Like I said, we do that by building some of the best multifamily buildings in town. I know we were very well received in Guilford with our project there. We're doing a new construction project in Putney right now, which has been very well received. A lot of the barriers that we find would also be the same as a private developer might find, just in getting proper density in a project to make it work for us, as well as permitting issues related to Act 250, V-Trans, things like that. So, and those aren't, like I said, necessarily problems, but they are barriers to some of our development.
There were quite a few units beyond the 9 outside of Brattleboro. Where are they particularly concentrated in certain towns? Where are they?
Well, we find for our biggest areas, service areas are in Windham County or Brattleboro, and then Windsor County is in Springfield. But there's also quite a bit in, I believe Bellows Falls is getting more, and that's an area too that we're looking to really expand into. It's part of our service area, especially when we merged with the Rockingham Area Community Land Trust, and it's an area that we find needs this type of housing. So a lot of these numbers that you see up here in Brattleboro that made it seem pretty tight. It's similar in Bellows Falls, and the housing stock in Bellows Falls looks like it needs some updating. So that's another area we're looking at strongly. So yep.
What areas do you consider as small town areas?
Well, we have developments, like I said, we're doing one right now in Putney, and we've done one in Putney before. That's a small town area for us. We have...
You don't go to towns, for instance, that have a population of less than 1,000.
Well, Putney's pretty close to 1,000, it's maybe 1,200, I think. But we have, let's see here, we have some developments in some pretty small towns. It is challenging, but it's certainly something that we might look at. Like I said, we do a market study to determine the viability of the project. It's hard to keep a project afloat with these rents. Fortunately, we're a nonprofit, so we don't have that end to worry about. But it costs $500 a unit to operate rental housing, and if we charge rents that are $450, obviously we need to make sure that we have a pretty low vacancy rate. And we've had some units in some areas that are tough to fill due to their location. Whitingham has been a challenge for us, for instance, but we do have a project there that is going along. So we do look towards population centers to build mainly, but we look where there's need.
But, for instance, I'm from Jamaica, but all along Route 30, there are small towns that have people that really are in need of affordable housing, and there's only substandard things or non-official places, tucked away.
Right, yeah.
There's no real emphasis at all on affordable housing in those areas, and there are a lot of people in need in those areas.
Right. Yeah, there's, like I said, it's when we look at building housing, we have to look for a certain amount of density to make a project work. But that's not to say that we wouldn't look in a center like that. But we mainly look in areas where we can draw in people that could serve a town like that. But in an area that we could get that density, which for us is around 20 to 25 units. So.
One more question, and then we'll move on.
Yep.
Yeah, just curious, how are you funded?
We are funded primarily through the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program administered by the Vermont Housing Finance Agency. That is where we get a lot of our funding from the state. We are funded a lot through the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, especially with Governor Scott's new housing revenue bond. That's been a pretty big help, especially in getting some of those units in the 80 to 120% of AMI range. Those units wouldn't qualify for tax credit funding. So this new housing revenue bond is really helping us meet that need, which there is also a substantial need there, kind of in the middle. Obviously, there's a need on the low end, but there's a need in the middle, which is hard to serve. And so those are two big sources. Obviously, community development block grants are another one, and we work with a lot of smaller funding agencies. The Windham Regional Commission often has funding sources available for specific needs, mainly related to energy. We've been using a lot of their funding sources a lot for the Clean Energy Development Fund in the state. and then obviously through federal programs in HUD.
Thank you, Peter. As you see, Peter is on the schedule a little later down, so if you have more questions.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Lane. I'm the Executive Director of Shires Housing here in Bennington. You're going to find that we're a very similar agency to Wyndham Windsor Housing Trust in terms of mission and what we do, and probably similar in economic makeup between the two counties. Our mission is to provide decent, safe, affordable housing to residents of Bennington County. Our lines of business are development, so we develop affordable housing, property management, we self-manage all of our units, and we also offer the support and services at home program, or SASH, to the community as well, including to Dover and Deerfield Valley. So what I looked at was some of the data and what drives demand here in Bennington. One of the things being poverty, which is certainly an issue here. And these are just a few bullet points that 1 in 3 children live in poverty in Bennington. 81% of the children are on free or reduced school lunch. The average wages are at 75% of the Vermont average, and household income is 188 out of 282 Vermont towns. That coupled with unemployment that's a little bit higher versus the statewide comparison, certainly drives the demand for housing that is affordable for families that are working, that maybe have to work 2 jobs or maybe are underemployed and having trouble making ends meet.
Stephanie, are these county numbers, or are they?
This is Bennington specifically for this one. Yeah. Okay, let's see if this works. Okay, and this is also related to Bennington. In the town of Bennington, there are approximately 6,700 housing units, and 2,508 are renter occupied. So we have the highest percentage of renter occupied units of any town in this area, or 37%. The Bennington Town Plan supports the development, and it supports public and private investment in housing that's affordable, safe, and decent. And really for all income levels, everyone has a right to have a decent, safe place to live. We do have challenging housing to redevelop here. Shires has done a lot of redevelopment projects. We completed the Bennington Historic Rehab Project last year, and that was a 26-unit project in scattered site historic homes, so nothing challenging about that, right? And it also included the relocation of all 26 households while we were rehabbing. No challenges there either. But it was successful. We are happy to say fully occupied, and all of our residents came back. We think that it turned out very, very well. We were able to do some additional site work and make it a really, really nice place for these folks to live and still affordable to them. And it's possible because of some of the funding sources that we were talking about earlier. We use a lot of similar funding for our projects. But the housing stock is aging, and it doesn't make sense for maybe a for-profit market developer to take on these kinds of projects, where for Shires it makes sense because it's mission-driven and it's not, economically driven as much. It has to make sense. The bottom line is the bottom line. We're still a business, and we still need to see that it makes sense, but we're going to tackle the ones that are maybe a little bit tougher, to deal with. I would say for us, the aging senior population definitely drives demand for some of our housing. The majority of it is family housing, but we do have a senior building, the Cora B. Whitney School, over on Gage Street. And would certainly look at that as our county population and state population is aging, factoring that into some of our development decisions in the future. Overall vacancy rates for Shires housing is less than 5%. So the demand is certainly there for our units, and I think that we have very, very high quality units for the price. What we're looking at in terms of affordability is around 30% of income. We don't want to overburden folks with high rent. If you're over 35%, you may in fact be turned down for a unit because it's simply not affordable for you. So people fall into that odd niche for us of, do you have enough income to support the rent in this property, and are you, income qualified? So, our niche is about this big of the market. So it has to be pretty specific for people to be able to qualify for housing. Some of ours are mixed. We have market in some units, but it's primarily affordable. And just anecdotally, throughout the county, because we do serve the entire county, we have units in Arlington and in Manchester. Most of our units are here in Bennington, but our market studies have been conducted recently in Manchester, in the town of Shaftesbury, and in Bennington, and they continue to demonstrate the demand and the need for affordable and workforce housing. In Shaftesbury, we've spoken to local employers who have told us that there's a lack of workforce housing, that people can't afford to live where they want to work. So that's an issue. They deserve to have a decent place that's affordable and that's not substandard. Some are living in hotels. And there are 7 units of affordable housing in the town of Shaftesbury. That's it. And they're ours, and they're on Route 67, and most people would consider it North Bennington, actually, the twin brick houses. So there's definitely a need in small towns like Shaftesbury for more affordable housing. In Manchester as well, the NEDS study noted a lack of affordable housing as well, or workforce housing, and that 60% of the people who work there cannot afford to live there. As part of our mission, we're also developing some affordable homeownership units in Manchester, and thanks to the Housing Revenue Bond Fund and to VHFA. And we hope to serve the underserved 80 to 120 portion of the community as well for home ownership. And in Arlington, some of the issues noted by town officials and municipalities was the lack of industry, that it's far removed from jobs, lack of affordable housing projects, and 2 of note are Arlington Village Center and Arlington Housing LP, both managed by Shires Housing. So I think that's what I have as far as slides, but does anyone have questions for me? Really?
So, who would you say that you're most targeted, like working force, someone that's on a subsidy, or?
I would say workforce, lower workforce though. Maybe it's retail, people who are piecing together a couple of jobs, or one of the parents works and one stays home with the kids.
Would you say that you cater to like college graduates that are looking for jobs in the area that may be in that tax bracket?
I would say as long as they are no longer a full-time student, yes, because there are certain parameters of the low-income housing tax credit program that would not allow us to rent to a full-time student, strangely enough.
If they're in a graduate program too? That's,
yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. But we do have units that don't have that restriction. So it's always, the answer is usually it depends, because there are so many funding layers and some have none at all, and it depends.
Would you say that the majority of your tenants actually work and are not on?
The majority of our tenants do work, yes.
Stephanie, when you mentioned what you're planning in Manchester for the 80 to 120,
Yes.
Are you referring to the East Branch?
I am, yes, yes, East Branch Farms. And it's phase 2 of an existing project. And it will include 5 affordable units and 3 market rate units at the site.
But will those affordable be the 80 to 120?
Yes, yes. Yep, those are the restrictions on those. A little higher for home ownership. You want to make sure there's longevity and sustainability when dealing with home ownership. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I believe it was the North Shire Economic Development Study, if I've got the name right.
Yes, yes.
Also identified, also noted that many people in Bennington County cannot afford to live where they work. And I remember they had this nice kind of overlapping graph of circles that you may recall, that basically showed that exactly that people can't live where they work. And I was just curious, have you or has anybody else sort of taken a step towards addressing that situation?
Well, I think Manchester is one of those towns, definitely. And one of the steps that we've taken is to complete the East Branch Farms project, but we also have 36 units of affordable workforce housing in Manchester as well. And I think the town officials and zoning have worked very hard to make it possible for us to continue East Branch Farms and are very supportive of affordable housing in that area. So I think they would fully support additional. I don't want to speak for them, but.
Well, I mean, just to respond to Tyler, I'm the planning and zoning director in Manchester, and the town has been working for the last 2 years to completely revamp the zoning ordinance.
Yes.
And one of the major impetus is to get more workforce housing in Manchester. And that overlapping circles that Tyler's talking about shows that in the North Shire, they're talking about Dorset, where Tyler works, Manchester, and Manchester Village, which is a separate municipality. And there is a need for 500 units of workforce housing in the North Shire. So the 5 units at East Branch is
It's a drop
it's
in the
something.
bucket, but it's a start.
The need is enormous. And Manchester, the Planning Commission is finishing the last revisions to the proposed ordinance, and it will go to the select board in March, and we'll see what happens. But, you know, I think we've heard anyway reluctance from certain developers about whether they think that people are actually going to move into these places if we build them. So that's something that, you know, aside from, you know, the Shire's work and those people that are maybe just above, you know, your targets, people are very concerned that they're not going to be able to find the people to rent these places in Manchester. So I wonder if people here can speak to that a little bit.
I know for our project, and as you said, it's just the teeniest dent in that number. We conducted 2 market studies to be sure, because there is that concern in Manchester. So yeah, we made sure that, you know, in our case, we wanted to be sure that that was true and that there would be demand. That does not guarantee demand, but it demonstrates it. And I know that the town has been very, very good with us in terms of restrictions on that property and zoning related to it to make this happen.
The ironic thing is the zoning's going to completely change, and all those bonuses you got there are going to be paltry compared to what you would be able to
See,
get.
timing is everything. I missed the boat again.
If it passes.
No, that's great though.
So.
And then just to follow up on that too, we found, especially in some of our developments in smaller towns like Guilford, I think the number was like 90% of the people that moved in there were from Guilford. And they went from a cost-burdened situation to an affordable situation.
Yeah. I would say 98% of the folks on our wait list are local Vermonters that are cost burdened.
There are a lot of people that work in Manchester actually live in Granville and you know, in New York, actually.
Right.
So, you know, building something and then getting them to move from Granville into Manchester into multifamily, multi-story, downtown kind of development, you know, I think people are really hesitant to. It's one thing for Bennington and for Brattleboro or even Springfield, but Manchester isn't considered a sort of happening city with a downtown that's worth living in. So it's a bigger.
It's a unique market for sure.
Yeah, I'd just like to emphasize something that Janet just brought up. I live about a block off of Route 30 in Dorset, and every morning there is a steady stream of cars with New York tags on them, heading south.
Going to Manchester.
Yeah, going to Manchester or Dorset or Arlington. And as Janet pointed out, some of these people drive from significant distances. ironically, we have a member of the Dorset Planning Commission who was previously associated with a, what I would call a fairly significant employer in Dorset. And they actually had a need for additional staff because the company is growing. And they couldn't find any. Because anybody who was looking for a job was living an hour and a half away.
Right.
So, even when there are jobs available, it's difficult to fill them because of the housing issue.
Right. And that's been our experience in speaking to local employers. They've expressed the same to us. That does drive the need. Sorry, sir.
I know this isn't your area, but you keep saying workforce housing, and the other part, the other side of this equation is transportation. And I wonder what effect it would have to have better transportation between Bennington and Manchester, or Brattleboro and Manchester, and why that isn't part of the equation.
I think for us it is to some degree. That's part of our process in determining a site, or in applications or in talking with funders, is it in close proximity or walking distance to public transportation. Yes, there are many areas that could use improvement. There have been some improvements in Manchester. I think the Orange Line now, right, is running. And in a place like Shaftesbury, it's about a half a mile from the bus stop, a site we're looking at. So this is, it's part of what we think about, absolutely, is proximity.
Where I come from originally, people figure they're going to, I don't know if you can tell from my accent, New York.
Yes.
People figure they're going to travel,
Yeah.
maybe an hour and a half to get the job they want. That's built into the economy there.
Right,
It seems to me if you want to live in Shaftesbury and work in Manchester, it's not a high-income job, and you can't afford to have a car.
Right.
At least if there was some public transportation, it would spread out the economic development along the whole route.
I agree with you.
Stephanie and Chris has that.
I'm sorry.
I'm Chris Camping, Executive Director of Wyndham Regional Commission, and we coordinate, all the RPCs coordinate transportation planning. There is actually proposed fixed route service on Route 30, but we're waiting for what's called CMAQ funding. It's just federal funding that supports transit to support it, but it's not there now.
Chris, will it go all the way to Manchester?
No, it goes as far as Jamaica.
Just stop.
You should come down and argue for it.
Well, we're working with Southeast Vermont Transit, but and ultimately these routes have to work. There has to be enough density for them to work. And so right now we're proposing to Jamaica. And part of what makes that work, frankly, are the hospital trips from Grace Cottage to Brattleboro Memorial Hospital. So these things have to pencil out. You just can't. I was MPO director in New York State and managed 14 different transit contractors. You can't just throw buses on every road and assume they're going to work. And Vermont, actually, I would argue, contributes significant funding to rural transit service, and it's actually, relative to both rural states, it's pretty good. It's not perfect, but there are a lot of other underlying issues around density, getting people to stops where you could actually pick them up. And unfortunately we haven't quite figured out teleportation yet, but right now because of the issues, especially on our smaller towns like on Route 30. And this I want to speak very briefly to, but the absence of being able to really develop any additional housing units in communities without any community water or sewer, just because of lot sizes and regulations and that kind of thing. I mean, we're actually at risk of losing housing units, I'm afraid, in some of our villages. It's going to be very insidious, but the return on investment is just not there necessarily to put $60,000 into a wastewater system in a house that's maybe valued at $100,000. We're seeing businesses and those villages also not able to expand or grow or even develop. And this is another fundamental issue because the primary planning goal in Vermont is to focus development in and around compact village centers surrounded by rural countryside. And that's what all regional commissions and towns are directed to do, but if you don't have community water or sewer, you can't do it. So the Guilford project, the Putney project that Peter was talking about, those were possible because of community water and sewer. And you were talking about 25 units to pencil out to make something work. You can't do that in most communities. And so this is a, to me, this is a fundamental state issue. It requires an all-in approach, just like clean water. You know, the state wants to put it on the town wants to put it on the village, and 60 people paying taxes in the village can't afford a community system. And not to go on about this, this is a fundamental problem in the state. And until we figure it out, the path of least resistance is building a house on a 10-acre lot on a Class 3 town road. And aging residents and frankly new residents coming to Vermont and other people, that's not necessarily what they're wanting anymore. They're wanting to be able to park, walk, and access amenities. So it's a larger planning issue, but we're going to have to bring the state more in. We're going to have more robust funding and actually make it a funding priority. Not to go on about that, but.
All right, one more question, or we're going to move on? All right, thank you, Stephanie.
Yeah.
Great. We have some representation from our federal delegation here. We have Sheila Reed from Senator Sanders' office and Megan Sullivan from Congressman Welch's office. If you guys want to step up, give a little your couple talking points.
Hi, everybody. My name is Sheila Reed. I'm an outreach representative for Senator Sanders. I'm based in St. Johnsbury, but I cover the entire state for housing and a few other things like seniors, young children, disabilities. And I've really wanted to come down to southern Vermont and meet all of you and make some connections. And one of the things I need you to know is Senator Sanders' office, and I have a bunch of these brochures, we are available to take all sorts of questions, concerns, and issues around housing, federal housing issues. So please contact us and have your residents contact us if you have issues around housing. I'm sure you probably know, the senator, first of all, you'll be happy to know the government is open right now. I think, I haven't checked my phone in about 5 minutes, but the senator is very interested in affordable housing as a tool of economic development, and he and other members of the delegation are continually working to expand current programs as well as to keep the administration from cutting funding for housing incentives. In recent years, he has co-sponsored the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act. He and the rest of the delegation are leading advocates for fully funding vital federal housing programs like the Community Development Block Grant and the Home Improvement Partnership Program. He supports efforts to help homeowners refinance their mortgages, and he co-sponsored legislation to provide a much-needed federal rental assistance program. As I'm sure you probably know, the Trump administration has omitted federal housing from its infrastructure plans while seeking deep cuts to existing federal housing programs. The delegation will work to include housing in any infrastructure package. There are a few other risks to housing programs at the federal level beyond budget cuts. Funding for the Housing Trust Fund is again at risk after being out of suspension for only 2 years. And Jen can probably tell you more about this too, but due to the unintended impacts from the tax bill signed into law in December, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac have announced they will likely need an advance from the U.S. Treasury. An advance violates policy set up by the Federal Housing Finance Agency, and it risks suspension of the statutorily required funding for the National Housing Trust Fund. The senator is working to urge Mel Watt, the director, to reconsider that policy and to continue contributions to the Housing Trust Fund. So that's one of the big things we're working on right now. Also, low-income tax credits, we're worried about those because of the tax bill. But we just feel that the appetite for these credits may decline with the lower corporate tax rate. And then the other thing we're watching very closely is the Community Reinvestment Act, which was passed in the 70s to stop redlining. And there's growing concern that the administration is going to try to weaken the CRA, as we call it. This law encourages banks to lend to low and moderate income neighborhoods. And we are tracking this closely. We feel they'll probably do it through loopholes. We don't have the details yet, but we're tracking it closely and we'll keep everyone informed. Thank you. Please stay in touch with our offices, and we're available.
Hi, my name is Megan Sullivan. I work for Congressman Peter Welch. Most of you may not have met me before because, candidly, I don't cover housing for the Congressman. Kevin Veller does, who you probably are more familiar with. I do, however, cover economic development and business, and as you know, housing is incredibly important for economic development and business, and the Congressman, whether he's speaking directly with housing advocates or working with businesses or on economic development projects, housing is at the top of the list in every conversation for workforce and for low-income housing. Addressing community needs. So this is an area where he will continue to be an advocate for fighting for federal funding. A few of the speakers have already talked about how federal programs are key in the work that they do. We know that in the spending bill last night, which since I've been on the road from Burlington today, I haven't been able to look at too much, but I know that there was in non-military spending, a $131 billion bump. So we're expecting housing programs maybe to see a bump in that going till March 23rd, until our next immediate crisis. We'll be keeping an eye on what programs look like, and certainly want to hear from you about programs that you're concerned with, that we can be watchful for you. The Congressman works closely with Senator Sanders and Senator Leahy to make sure that Vermont's best interests are put forward, and that programs like CDBG and new market tax credits will continue to be available and thrive for our communities. Thanks so much.
I have a bunch of business cards back there.
Thank you. All right, we're going to move on to our panel discussion on housing products. We have Jen Holler of VHCB. She's going to moderate for us. We have Bob Stevens of M&S Development, Paul from TPW Real Estate, Peter with Wyndham Windsor, and John Hale of Hale Resources. So you guys want to come on down.
Sarah, just kick it off. Okay. So, hi, my name's Jen Holler. I'm with the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, and I can talk a little bit more about that later, but I've been involved in housing in a number of different ways over a number of years, beginning at the federal level, advocating for housing and community development programs, and then with the state here, the Vermont Community Development Program, at VHCB earlier, administering a federal home program, and then recently as Governor Shumlin's housing commissioner, and I've had an opportunity through that to meet many of you, so it's nice to see some familiar faces, and there are a lot of faces that I don't know actually, so I wonder if we could do it just to help orient us, if to get a sense of who's here. If you are a municipal official or from a town level, could you raise your hands? Okay, awesome, great. Regional planning commissions? Terrific. Okay, are there funding agencies, state or federal? Great. And then any other lenders? Terrific. Okay. That helps us get a sense of it. So great. So I'm going to ask each of the folks on the panel to introduce themselves just really quickly. And excited about this. We've got a variety of perspectives coming together here that's going to be able to enable us to talk about affordable housing, but also the other parts of the housing market. So we'll kick off with Peter.
Sure. So Peter Paggi, Wyndham Windsor Housing Trust.
Bob Stevens. I'm with Stevens & Associates, architecture engineering firm, probably 30 years designing housing and projects around the county, a lot of work with Peter's organization over the years, and also M&S Development. So it's a development company that focuses mostly on downtown and Newmarket tax credit projects. Brooks House is an example. We're working on the Putnam Block in Bennington now.
John Hale, I'm local to Bennington. Property management company, general contractor, property development, investor, and I have other investors that invest with us. We manage about 150 apartments in the Bennington area right now.
Paul Carocchio, my wife and I, Christy, my wife and I own TPW Real Estate. We're a real estate service business based in southern Vermont, and we basically sell, rent, and manage homes and commercial properties.
Great, thank you. So I'm just going to ask a couple questions just to kind of get things going. I think we'll run through the four of you again. And honestly, I left my list of questions in the car, and you can't download them. I think I remember most of them. But then also we'll take some. Oh, awesome. That's perfect. And then we'll be sure to leave time for questions. And if there's anything you folks want to be sure to bring up, do that too. So we've heard from Peter, so maybe we'll start on this end and ask you to sort of just generally describe what are the challenges that your clients face. What are you seeing as it relates to housing? And that can be pretty broad too.
Sure. So our business is primarily in the North Shire in terms of residential and sales and rentals, and I think you could put things in buckets. Basically, there's the buyer that wants to have a new home, a starter home, and they'll be in the $50,000 all the way to the $250,000 range, and that product is almost non-existent. And if it does exist, the quality doesn't really matter. It sits on the market for about 10 days. And in fact, we just 3 days ago, our firm had one go on the market at $210, and it got into a three-way bidding war and was under contract in 3 days at a much higher number. Then there's the other bucket. Then there's the 250 to 400, I think is a good zone, where just alone in the towns of, say, Manchester and Dorset, we have something like 50 homes on the market in that zone. And there are a lot of people looking in that zone, but they're not ready to buy, and then it becomes sort of a threshold of affordability because the quality is not necessarily up to, say, a lender's standards or a building inspector standards. So you start hitting a threshold of the buyer can afford the sort of the picture of the home, and then all of a sudden, once the building inspection is done, there's another 10 to 20% in cost, and it throws out the whole, their affordability scenario. Once you go to 400 and above, I mean, I can talk to the 400 to $1 million range, and it's a real soft spot because the average home buyer is going to put down 20 to 30% equity. And once at 400,000, that's $100,000 to $120,000. It's a big number for anybody, really. Once you get closer to $1 million, the banks like to have 50% equity, or at least that's what we're seeing. And not a lot of those transactions happening. In fact, it's a very stale part of the market. And then $1 million up is really just needles in the haystack, for us at least, and I think probably all of Bennington County. On the rental side, and speaking to that, I think the biggest lack of inventory for the real estate industry is those homes under $350,000 that are in good shape. A $250,000 home that is modern with no deferred maintenance, which is hard to find, we could probably, all the agencies all day long could sell those, and I think we could attract people to our communities. And I suspect the same is true throughout Bennington County. On the rental side, rental rates, at least in my opinion, seem to be high for the quality of what you're getting. Doesn't mean that the rate is high or not affordable, but it's actually the quality of the product, the apartment, the studio, the house. you know, we have this, since the recession started, homeowners that have left the area for jobs haven't been able to sell their homes, and they've since put them on the market for rent. But they've also not had the income to deal with deferred maintenance. So you have a domino effect of rental rates high because it's what the owner wants, but the quality of the product is going down. So we have a challenge in our rental product, which leads to affordable housing or just workforce housing or something that's new would be a really attractive thing, I think, to get the community going. So that's kind of the real estate sales and rentals report. I'm not as familiar with Bennington. John could probably speak to that more, for sure, on the rentals. But I think in again, my opinion, it's probably the same issue in Bennington, just at a different numbers sets that may be variable from not 250 being the high end, but maybe 200's the high end of that first set. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. So John, there's all this need for housing. So why aren't the contractors building more of it, investors making more of it if everybody needs it?
Well, the challenge is.
So what are the challenges?
It's the cost. You know, even if we buy homes for in the $30,000 to $40,000 range, and you know, at the end of the day, you put $100,000 to $150,000 in a house that's maybe going to go sell for $130,000, $150,000. So the challenge is the cost of construction is just astronomical. If you want to build that house, you're going to build it in a neighborhood that's, you know, you might spend $225,000 building a single-family home, 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, you know, 1,800 square feet. But in the neighborhoods of downtown Bennington, that house is going to sell for maybe $150,000. You might get $175,000. There's a few neighborhoods in the area that, you know, you might get what you put into it, but you know, as a for-profit company, that's not something that most developers would want to do. You know, when we started buying single-family homes, I'd be working till midnight every night and doing it myself, which was sweat equity, and we were making a profit, and that's what we used to start developing apartment buildings. And that kind of took off, the apartment buildings. So the apartments are a little different because you can, you know, the quality is important. We try to make them bulletproof, and we can keep the expenses down a little more when we're renting the buildings out. So we can actually make the building cash flow, but the quality of rentals in Bennington is extremely low. I mean, there's some buildings that, you know, a pack of dogs may have lived in it at one time, so literally. You know, and people moving here, they see that stock and they're like, wow, this is a pretty tough place to live. I mean, we have a tendency to really put our investment back into our properties, and if somebody trashes an apartment, we'll do the effort to get it back up to par. But there's a lot of mom and pop landlords, there's a lot of people that are older that have owned their buildings for 30, 40 years that don't have the money, that don't have the effort or the ability to continue to invest in those houses. And, you know, they're trying to sell them at fair market value, which, you know, someone like me would have to go in there and spend, you know, $30,000, $40,000 a unit in order to get it up and running correctly and be attractive to rent to people that want to move here and get jobs. So, which we find is a huge missing target for this area, that there's a lot of young people that are trying to move here and they can't find housing that fits their budget, that's good quality housing for them. They don't want to live in, you know, the center of town where there's, you know, the crime and the drug problems, and, you know, that's a big issue with the rental in Bennington, so.
This is the problem statement part of the conversation.
Yeah.
We'll try to get to some of the solutions. But Bob, you've got a special niche working with communities that are trying to sometimes create housing, but also meeting other goals around community revitalization and coming back from devastating natural events. So what kind of observations would you like to offer?
Well, I think, and I guess I should have mentioned that I also sit on the SEVEDS and the BDCC boards for probably over 10 years, and somewhat immersed in the data around economics and housing. So fundamentally, it's important to understand that we have a very large demographic underlying issue in these two counties, and an economic issue. And to put that succinctly, We're not adding any population. You know, we've had a growth of housing over the last 20, 30 years because of reduction in housing sizes. You know, people are building houses because the size of the number of occupants per building has gone down. And at this point, we sit at a time where we are really the oldest counties in the state and one of the oldest states in the country. And a large demographic group that's moving out of the workforce, and a lot of them, you know, we think is going to drive a demand. A lot of those people, those seniors, those baby boomers, are going to want to live in walkable urban places. So if there's a demand, an underlying market demand for housing, it's going to be in those locations, which might free up single-family detached houses eventually, if anybody could afford to build in walkable urban places. So that gets to the economic issue. And this is across the board. We see this in whether you're building for industrial, mixed-use buildings. You know, the housing gets close to working, actually. The housing, in some ways, there's perhaps some strategies to work around the edges. But the way we like to describe this, if you are, let's take an industrial building. If you want to build an industrial building today, at the end of the day, what John was saying about the cost to construct, it's the hard cost alone is $130 a square foot. The appraised value, what it's worth, is $30. There's a difference of $100 a square foot there. It's like, how do you do that? And it's perhaps worse in the kinds of things that we do and sort of deep retrofit downtown redevelopment projects. Our rule of thumb is that it's going to cost $300 a square foot to build, and it's worth $100 a square foot. So, you know, so going back to the lending, you know, if you're buying your house, you can go to the bank and say, well, you know, it appraises that I can get a loan for 80% of the appraised value. I've got to bring 20% to the table. If it's appraising at $100 a square foot, you're going to get 80% of $100 a square foot for something that costs you, you know, that's 25% of the cost in debt. What do you do with the rest of that? There's no economic incentive. You can't invest in that. So this is really the crux of the issue. And it comes back to an economy, quite frankly, that doesn't work. Our economy is broken. And so we find other ways to do that. I'm not saying that nothing gets built. We have, you know, affordable housing, which brings deep subsidies. Some of the work we do brings deep subsidies. You have some businesses that say, well, I'll build because I can make money out of the building. And if it's a bank and they need a new image, and they'll build a building and pay for that some other way. Even industrial projects we find stall unless you either can bring subsidy or they have other assets to borrow against and they make enough money out of the ground to build something. But, you know, economically we're kind of bumping up against that. So I think, you know, housing is a symptom of a bigger issue. So it's important to understand that. There are a number of different things that people are doing to kind of deal with, you know, helping, you know, sort of relieve the pressure. We know we need to bring people to this area. We have a huge problem of finding people to work in businesses. And as soon as we start having that conversation, we say, well, we don't have any available housing to put them in. You know? So it's one thing feeds on the next. So it's a systematic issue that is going to take interventions in a number of different areas. I'll stop there. We'll talk for the next round.
So Peter, you had a chance to talk a little bit about the development side of what Wyndham and Windsor Housing Trust does, and then you also operate a homeownership center,
right,
which helps folks with single-family homes. I wonder if you could say whatever you already have on your mind, but also talk about a little bit about the barriers that the people that you're helping in single-family homes through your homeownership centers, what they're encountering.
Well, you know, a lot of the people that we help in the homeownership section are lower income and maybe didn't have the best credit history or had some debts earlier in their life. So we work a lot through that, and they go through counseling that can take, you know, upwards of a year to 2 years to actually get through. We offer, you know, home buyer education classes, which also some banks require, some lenders require, and you know, that kind of offers some guidance to people who aren't necessarily familiar with the process. But I think Bob touched on a lot of what we see, and which is people want to buy houses that they can afford, obviously, but a lot of times the houses that they can afford, and John touched on this too, aren't good houses and won't necessarily appraise for what they can afford. We fortunately also have a program called the Shared Equity Program, which allows some subsidy into the single family, the purchase of the house, which could allow somebody to buy a better quality house that that affordability will then stay with, which is a great program. But generally, the problems that are in Windham and Windsor County are the problems that are in Bennington County that John had touched on. There aren't necessarily great houses. They're all older. They're not, they all have problems associated with them. People can't build new affordable, private developers can't build new affordable houses and sell them for $200,000. It's challenging, even on our rental housing development side, we always run into issues and we specifically don't make a profit. It's challenging for us as well. Yeah, really, those are the big issues that we see, the exact same things. Rental housing stock that's substandard, but is still commanding, a price that people can't afford. Yeah.
So for a long time, actually since the 1930s, the federal government's been involved in providing some, we've used the word subsidy a lot, but for to make housing that is affordable to level, that people with very low incomes, has not worked for a very long time. And starting after the Depression, the federal government began participating in the area to fill that gap between what it costs to build housing and then what very low income people can afford. But what's happened over time as the economy's taken the direction that Bob described, there are more and more income levels that are affected by that gap. So now you're really into even the middle market. And that's part of why the governor proposed the housing revenue bond, because most federal programs are designed to help people who make 80% of the median or below. And actually the most powerful federal program is the low-income housing tax credit, which serves people who are 60% or below. But right now the private market's not creating housing between that 80 to 120 range, and that was part of why the governor proposed that, and the legislature they hear from their communities the same thing, and so they signed on and that went forward, and I can talk a little bit more about that. But municipalities, you're seeing the need. I hear from municipal officials a lot. They want to try to do something. You're not going to fix the economy, but what are the top 3 things that municipalities can do to help encourage investment in housing, whether that's new housing or investment in the existing stock?
I'll take a shot at that.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Paul.
So one that I'm very closely involved in, Janet spoke to it earlier, is the Manchester zoning change. From a real estate service provider's perspective, that excitement around the zoning change has in and of itself created economic development going on. The town doesn't know about it yet, but I do. So I'll pat them on their back. But for an example, and I can't use names or even any details, but I know of 300 affordable housing units going to be sitting on Janet's lap in a few months for applications in Manchester.
You better be at the select board.
Well, I've been at them all, right?
Right.
So those are economic development clearly for me. Then they become economic development for the trade construction management world. And then I think, if the towns can get together, and the biggest problem we have is educating all of the town, and it's so hard to do, but all of the townspeople that vote and show up at these zoning meetings and come out of the woods with these questions, and they're really just uneducated comments. So that's one experience I have closely where I live, and I think it'll be great. I've also experienced it in Dorset, where it's the opposite, where Dorset has sort of defined, I think, itself as they don't want much development. So they've, in recent times, a group of public citizens, and I think to some degree the Planning Commission did a great job dealing with it. There was some sort of a groundswell around development and economic development around some restaurants and facilities, and the town kind of came together and said, no, we don't want it here. We want that to be in Manchester. It was a really interesting message, but it reverberated through the real estate community in our industry where, oh, okay, we should be selling houses in Dorset and maybe focus on Manchester, Bennington as the commercial development cores. That was just a message from the community. So I think when you talk about municipal, the municipal side, first of all, we don't give those people enough support because they're volunteers for the most part. And they're working tirelessly to solve these problems in their volunteer time. And the public, we need to figure out how to educate, not the people in this room. We all know what's going on. It's everybody else. And I don't know what, I've tried to figure out how do you get out there. I'm the president of the Manchester Business Association, and we've had a very difficult time communicating with the voters of the county, of the towns. And I don't know if it's newspaper. We've had a real, newspaper, social media, whatever it is. I think that's where we need to really get to.
The chamber too.
That chamber's doing a great job. And it's done a great job in the last 2 years, just really getting the messages out there. More of this and getting it on TV with Andrew for people to watch.
I think there's another thing that,
Thoughts on this?
yeah, I think that a partnership with businesses in the area, not just the municipality partnering with 1 or 2 businesses, but really selling that, all the businesses in the area need to work together as well. We all have the same problem. We can't find employees that fill the jobs that, for businesses like mine, I'm growing, and we're trying to find good and young people to, take these positions, and it's difficult because, but everybody's got the same problem. So if we worked in numbers, and marketed ourselves a little better outside of this area, and the municipality was on board with that as well, I mean, I think that would attract more young people to say, hey, I never even thought of living in Vermont. I mean, we walk around with our phones and everything is tracked. I mean, when you see a college graduate that's about ready to graduate, why don't we throw an ad up on his phone saying, he's looking for a job, come to Vermont. So, technology today, you can sell an awful lot at your fingertips.
I would sort of emphasize that I agree that I don't think there's a shared understanding in the communities of challenges before us and our experience in working municipalities as well. There's still, actually, I think that there was a study, the Vermont Futures Project, for those that have seen that, which was a really good analysis of the changing in demographics, and a lot of the culture of doing work within our towns is driven from the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s when we were growing and we were trying to manage the growth that was just coming at us. So there's a whole, well, that's changed. Instead of now, we have really need to figure out how do communities capitalize on opportunities, how to leverage the assets that you have to sort of grow your grand list, grow your economy, provide the services that you can, and in some ways survive. You have to backfill people who are going to move out of the workforce somehow. We find often that when we start to do a project in the town that might have a positive impact to the community doesn't know how, they don't have a system in place to judge whether that's positive or negative. And often it's like, well, what are you going to do for us? It's like, well, what we're doing for you is bringing this. This is huge benefit at the end. You're trying to build momentum. But as opposed to other places around the country, other states, where sure, we understand we're a partner in this as a town. The town is, in the buildings that we own, I don't know, 10% of our revenue goes back to the town in taxes. It's the jobs that we provide, help pay other tax that feed other businesses around them. It is, the municipalities are partners in all of these projects. They stand to benefit if they can pick winners and losers, so to speak. So I don't believe we have a good understanding of how to do that or systems in place to kind of leverage that. And in some ways, a culture and a mindset that needs to change. Our working population as a percentage of the total population in southern Vermont is very small because a lot of people are retired and they moved up here and they said, well, okay, I'm done. I want to shut the door. I'd like to keep this the way it is. It's not helping us be sustainable at all because, we need to have function in our economy somehow. The restaurants, the places we enjoy, the businesses that are here also need to function. And so I think that it's an education. It's a long conversation. You can't do it around a project. Somebody rolls out a project and then neighbors say, I don't like this, or I'm afraid it's going to affect the character of my home. And we get in turmoil sort of talking about that project. It needs to be a conversation that happens between those times where we can kind of create a common understanding of what we want to do.
Can I add a quick comment? Sorry to reflect on that, and Bob brings up a good point. We continue to talk about expense cuts and subsidies, but we very rarely talk about investment in what we have and marketing it to the greater masses. And we listen to what's going on at the state level. We're always cutting marketing. We're always cutting the Department of Tourism. We're always cutting the chambers. In fact, we're cutting the chambers so much that they're going out of business. And they're the people that actually sit in at their computers and market us to the world. And when we market ourselves to the world, we sell a good, which happens to be, I think it's the lifestyle of Vermont and the natural beauty, which we've created through Act 250, and we don't sell it. And so we're not even bringing in the top dollar. All we're talking about is survival, when the top dollar is what many other states are doing. And right over our border in Saratoga Springs themselves generate $6 million in tax revenue from lodging to market Saratoga Springs. That's more than our state budget on marketing the state. They do it in one town. And I think if we could focus a little bit on that, if anybody has a business where you sell a product, if you're selling your product for a higher margin, you have more left over to not have to cut down on your vendors. You don't have to cut down on the cost. You don't have to buy cheap stuff.
And reinvest.
Yeah, and you can recapitalize. So I wanted to hit that on the municipal. But municipalities are not doing that. They do not think they need to be involved in that process, state across and even at the state level.
And we'll take so in your experience, in Wyndham and Windsor's experience, or actually your sister organizations around the state, what is most helpful? What is the most helpful thing you see that municipalities are doing to bring housing investment to their communities?
Well, I feel, especially in our case, municipalities are supporting us, which is great. Whether it's through general support of projects in their town, through active participation in community development block grants. I think the biggest thing for us in greater communities, which municipalities could help with, is perception. We're talking about workforce housing and bringing this 80 to 120% AMI workforce housing into our developments. People that make $20,000 a year, $25,000 a year, that's what we do already, and that's workforce housing. That's those people, they live in unsubsidized apartments, affordable apartments, working jobs, and we make housing that they can afford, and they can afford to stay in, they can afford to stay in the community. And I think it's a perception issue that we provide housing for the homeless, which we do and we're proud of, and that we provide subsidized housing, which we do and we're proud of, but we also provide that housing to that group that's making $25,000 and $30,000 a year, and that's we need that's a positive thing, and I think municipalities recognize that, and it'd be great to get that out into the general public.
The Housing and Conservation Board provides funding for grants and loans for housing development around the state. And so we see the experience that our local partners, which are usually organizations like Wyndham and Windsor Housing Trust and Shires Housing in Bennington, there's a network. There's a statewide network of regional housing nonprofits that are basically the delivery system for housing, for affordable housing in Vermont. But the point that I'd like to try to make is that affordable housing means a lot of things to a lot of different people. And for some people it can mean subsidized, maybe challenged, Cabrini Green, really dense, not very well taken care of housing for folks that get a lot of government support. But really, if you look at the federal definition, technically is housing that's affordable to people who make 80% of the area median or below. But I think when we all talk about affordable housing, and this is where municipalities can help with the messaging too, is that you need housing that's affordable at all different levels. You need it affordable for folks who are those extremely low income folks. Maybe they're homeless, maybe they have no income at all. They need a place to call home. But then you also need housing, which is more typical what happens with VHCB funding and the low income housing tax credit. So people up to 60% of the median, and that's affordable to them. And then you need homes that are affordable for people who are 80 to 120. In some cases, for a family of four, that's folks up to $85,000. And then, higher income folks, we want them to find affordable homes here. We need them to come to Vermont too.
Yeah.
We need it at all ranges. So I think if we could all understand what affordable housing means, it doesn't always mean deeply subsidized, troubled.
Can I interject something
housing
there?
units.
We rent to very similar demographics. I mean, we have Section 8 tenants, we have people that are working in the workforce that aren't making, making $25,000, $30,000 a year. We rent to that demographic. What we find is that the people coming here that are just above that bracket cannot find good, quality, affordable housing in that, that 80 to 120, maybe 130%.
Yeah.
That stock is really non-existent.
Which, it's challenging for us to develop that because of the tax credits. It only goes up to 60%.
I understand that.
Yeah, but
it's challenging for us to go to that next step
absolutely.
because
Yeah.
you have to spend all that money and the return is not there to cover the cost of building that kind of housing. Unless you buy something that's 100,000, like we built an 11-unit complex. We bought a 3-acre, 10,000 square foot building for $100,000. So that was the only way we could do it because it was foreclosed. It was a bed and breakfast. And we turned it around and it's it's that bracket that's over 100% that's living there and it's 0% vacancy factor. We never have a vacancy there. Somebody's moving out, we have it rented before the person moves out.
Our niche is 80 to 120 and then over 120
Yeah.
in downtowns. But it's deeply subsidized. It's almost as subsidized as the affordable housing because quite frankly, you can't
isn't it?
build and renovate that.
Programs.
Just different programs.
And we've done ours with no subsidy on any of our projects and it's,
Can't do it without that.
we're buying foreclosures and things that are
But we
at
need to do
discount
more of
prices.
that, yes, because,
Yeah.
we
And it
need
is-
to have all sectors working at it.
Right, and that's why we're excited about the housing revenue bond because we're able to serve that population where normally we couldn't have that 80 to 120. So.
It is interesting, we're doing like data research on downtown Bennington, and so just, again, because I like data, a couple of statistics. That within the designated downtown, there's 130 existing housing units now. The median income is about $25,000. So effectively, all of those 130 units are probably non-subsidized affordable housing. There's a few that we know of that are not. But it's essentially, that's the demographic. And there's a high vacancy rate, about 50% vacant in downtown Bennington as well. So we were looking at the project that we're working on at the end of the day of adding about 35 units of 80 to 120 and another 35 over 120 and saying, what is that mix? What's the healthy mix of a place? What do you want that distribution to be? And I don't know that, we know the answer. We've been sort of looking at, who's put thought into this around the country. What's a healthy place? Do you want concentrations of poverty? Do you want concentrations of wealth? Or do you want something that's a normal distribution? Our sense is a normal distribution would be just great. If you had a bunch in the middle, some on the low end and some on the high end, you'd have a pretty resilient and healthy place. And that, again, it's just a different perspective to think about your town. How do you help all of those sectors sort of come together so that there's decent housing that's affordable for each one of those sectors and a marketplace that starts to work because you can kind of serve that. But most of our downtowns actually have very little on the middle to upper end, and just because they've been in decline for generations. People own those buildings, they haven't collected enough rent to take care of them. The conditions are getting worse and worse. There's a lot of deferred maintenance, and you're in a cycle that it's awfully hard to break that cycle.
So there are a couple, I'm going to go off track here a little bit, but just there are a couple of proposals that are floating around at the state, in the State House. I mean, I have to say housing is more of a focus from the legislature and on the administration's agenda than I have ever seen it, and I think it's because of the urgency around it. But there are a couple proposals that are getting kicked around right now, and I'd like to maybe just mention those and see what people think if they would help or not. So last year was housing revenue bond, and it was designed to provide funding for developments that can go up to a higher income range. So we've talked about that. This year, there are proposals for expanding the down payment assistance program that's available through the Vermont Housing Finance Agency. They can't meet the demand, so that's one proposal out there to do more of that. Another is, let's see, to create a homeowner tax credit, so that if somebody buys a home in certain, they would pick 3 pilot communities, and does certain level of renovation, that they could get up to 30% of qualified expenditures, you know, up to, I think it's $20,000 to $25,000 worth of work, and then you could get 30% tax credit on those amounts. And I'm wondering if people think that would be helpful. So let's start with maybe you, Paul, and
Sure.
John, and because you guys work with the private.
Yeah, I mean, I
in
think
the single family market more.
those credits have a downstream effect on the economy. There's no question early on they have a immediate benefit. But I think also, first of all, yeah, my general answer is yes, they benefit, and whatever they are. In Vermont, we're at the point where I think anything helps. We'll take free money all day long. But I think downstream we get into we get back in that rut of it's not real. And so, yes, that credit helped, but what about the job they have? What about the economy we're in? And there's plenty of money out there. Plenty of money. But we need to figure out how to get it here in an economy that actually can support itself.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a big fan of, privatization of just make it work, rather than let's figure out how to make it work for someone so that they don't have to think how to make it work. That's just a general statement, but there are people, we have a whole slice of our workforce that needs help.
Mm-hmm.
And the workforce housing is a huge perk, but the homeowner tax credit program, I mean, like 3 months ago when everybody was talking about what's gonna happen without the mortgage interest, right, or property tax write-off as a deduction.
State and local property tax.
And the reality is, it's not a big enough number that it changes people's decision. We haven't seen it on the purchasing side. And for sure, the numbers that are way up in the sky, those people don't really care. They can afford it. And even down in the lower number, people just need to have the home so they can live there and work. And we're talking about a few $100s.
Yep.
It's not a huge deal, but so I think in the short term anything helps, but we have to be cognizant of the long term and what the downstream impact is on that. And while we're talking about that, when we look at developing the downtowns, Brattleboro, Rutland, Bennington, et cetera, White River Junction's kind of happening again. What happens when those people that have owned those properties for 80 years or in their family and they've turned them over and they haven't been charging market rate, and then the light bulb goes off and says, holy moly, I'm gonna charge market rate or I can get it.
Yeah.
All of a sudden that supplants those people that were living there to somewhere else.
Right.
And I think we have to be cognizant as a community, what are we doing for those 135 homes that if Bennington really hits a home run with the Putnam block,
Are you gonna displace people?
we're going to displace, we are going to displace people.
Yeah.
It's inevitable. Same thing with Manchester. Same thing with Brattleboro. I think we're already seeing it in Brattleboro.
Well, I think what you hear from other places that have been really successful in revitalizing their communities, some will say they did a better job than others than at anticipating that and putting in mechanisms up front that was going to assure a mix of affordability levels in their community going forward. So it's important for us to be thinking about that now. Anybody else want to comment on the homeowner tax credit idea, or then there's something else I want to throw out? Okay.
I think it's a great idea, and like Paul said, it gets us in a rut where we're really helping someone to purchase a house, but the real problem is that the housing stock is so dilapidated and neglected that we really need to be concentrating on changing that whole concept of, for a homeowner to be able to get funds to renovate their house and fix the capital improvements that they have to do. I think that's a much better program, because those are the areas that people already own a home, they can't afford to do that.
And I didn't probably describe it well, but this credit is actually designed for the work that somebody would do. If they buy a home and then do improvements, then the credit would be on some level of those improvements.
But it should not only be for, single-family homes. I think that the housing stock for the rental
for the rentals too.
It's there for the nonprofits, but, you know, people like us trying to purchase the same buildings that I mean, we're competition, so to speak, but, you know, we're trying to do the same, our goal is the same. I mean, we're trying to supply a good quality house for somebody to live in. We're doing our background checks and credit checks and making sure that they can afford the house, and, you know, it only meets 35% of their income to pay rent. I mean, we're doing the same exact thing. But the challenge is that for us to raise the capital to do what these guys are doing is extremely difficult.
Can I ask a question, maybe Jen, you can add, in terms of capital that comes into the state? Because ultimately, there were some questions before about how do we do more of what's being done. The tax credit, the affordable housing tax credits are, what's it, 25 million a year? What is that?
Oh,
isn't there
you
sort of
know,
like
low-income
a-
housing tax credits, there's the equivalent, I think it's, no, it's more like 2.8 million in these credits, but that generates a lot more equity than I don't have that number on the top of my head, but you're exactly right. I mean, what prevents more of this to happening is that there's just not, there's not enough funding.
I mean, I think of the Shires, Wyndham, Windsor, that, you know, and all of the other regional affordable housing organizations, you know, they can do 20 to 23 units a year. You know, that's kind of what funding is available to sort of put together the kind of complex projects that they do. And that's the rate at which things get gets renovated or.
And we do 2 to 3 as a private investor.
Yeah.
And if you talk about it on a statewide, how do you ramp this up? How do you do more? There has to be either a way to make a return on the investment or some other way to bring capital to the table, which is tough.
That's right.
There's
So,
a limited pot of money.
And so the funding programs really do limit it. The housing revenue bond is helping us do some of that more, fill more of that gap. But for example, the low-income housing tax credit round is coming up in April, and they do one a year. They have 10 or 12 projects in front of them, things like the Putney Landing project or, you know, Monument View in Bennington. Those of you might be familiar with that scale of project. They've got 12 of them before them, and they'll be able to do 4 or 5. And all those other projects, you know, that are queuing up and be ready to go will need to wait another year, and then there'll be more coming in. So, yeah, that's a key factor.
It's a help, but it doesn't.
So another thing that's floating around in the legislature right now is the idea of, and recognizing that a lot of the housing stock is in tough condition, and sometimes people are living in places that you wouldn't want a family member or even a pack of dogs to live in. But one of the things under discussion right now in some of the committees is greater enforcement of the state's rental housing safety code. So that tends to elicit a lot of opinions from people whenever they take that up in the legislature. But that's something that they're seriously taking a look at, and I wonder what people think about that, or what. Yeah, actually open that one up to everybody. I mean, do you think that'd be useful in your communities or not?
Well, I can.
Go ahead, Peter.
These are proposing any of these, but these are just reporting on the discussions that are happening up there.
So, you know, from our perspective, we buy the empty shells and the rundown buildings, and renovate them. That's our specialty. That's what we do. Everything that John said, you know, is too expensive to do. For the private developer, you know, that's I think a place where we can come in and do that. But for example, we just, or not just, but last August purchased a property with plans to do a gut renovation, a complete, you know, strip it down to the studs and do a gut renovation. But we got to the point in one building where we had to make the decision just to completely tear it down due to a awful mold condition that people have been living in for who knows how long. And you know, there were other issues associated with that property, but you know, it was, you know, we talked about substandard housing stock. I think this is the, you know, kind of one of the lowest of the low examples. But people were living in it full time, you know, doing, you know, who knows what kind of damage to their body just due to this just atrocious mold issue, which is something that could have been avoided if there was a you know, more inspection of the property. That being said, to some of the other problems we were talking about, you know, with private landlords that have owned their building for 40 years and don't have the money to, you know, those aren't necessarily slumlords or bad people. They just don't necessarily have the money to fix it up. But it is something that we notice a lot, and we, to a certain extent, seek out properties like this. But it is readily apparent to us that there are a lot of properties that could have benefited from maintenance 10 to 15, 20 years ago that still haven't gotten.
I have a comment. This may be a funny analogy, but isn't it funny that we have our cars inspected every year?
Yeah.
For emissions and lights working or not and horn, but we don't have our homes, and I'll take that to another level. On the residential sale side, every time a home transfers, there's as much paperwork to do on that home before it even sells, probably as much as buying a car. And it includes carbon monoxide, smoke, lead, building inspection usually. I mean, 99% of all home purchases have a building inspection by a licensed or qualified, I think they're talking about licensing home inspectors. So every time a home changes, that new homeowner can pretty much be assured that they have a home that's free of mold, lead, and is up to code on smokes and COs. The one thing I think is ridiculous is we do test the water if the homeowner or purchaser chooses to, but we don't have a statewide testing of residential wells, even though we do on communities and municipalities. So comparing that to these apartment buildings that have been owned for 60 years, when's the last time one of those routine inspections has gone on? And a renter is less likely to wonder about those things than a homeowner. So we've added sort of insult to injury. So I'm a big fan of ramping up the inspection process, but we need qualified people to do it. And the state lacks, they lack the number of people, they lack qualified people that are out there inspecting. And sometimes I get the feeling, we manage about 5,000 homes in Vermont, and the reality is they're mostly condos, and sometimes I feel like the state's just chasing projects to make $1 on the permit fees. And that feels like that. And then they just find stuff. Rather than actually, you want to say to those inspectors, hey, why don't you go and inspect that 50-unit apartment complex in Burlington that you probably haven't been through in 100 years.
I think enforcement has really been completely lacking. There's been inspections. I don't think there's a lot of follow-up just because of the workforce. Really, it's the integrity of the owner. And, I hold ourselves to a high standard, and I really don't want to get in trouble for something that, God forbid something happened to somebody because I neglected to do something correctly, even just put a fire extinguisher in the kitchen, so. But I think that there's been inspections that have been accomplished, but then the follow-up to make sure that those items are corrected is really where the issue stands, so just because of manpower, there's 6,700 homes in Bennington, 2,500 of them are rentals. You got one person doing it. How does that person keep up? It's an impossible challenge for him.
So Bob, is it okay if we skip you
Sure.
on that question and then open it up to everybody? We've got about 5 more minutes. If anybody's got questions for any of us, yes.
Yeah, I just want to address what John and Paul both touched on, and again, the age of housing stock in Vermont. I'm a lender, and continually these folks are trying to buy these houses, and typically the houses that they can afford are some of the older houses. Which once they get in there, not only do they have a lot of depreciation and deferred maintenance, but the cost to heat that house and so forth. You spoke about the VHFA assist funds, ranging up, which are right now $5,000.
Yeah.
They increased that, that's great, but what we really need are for funds to be available at the time of purchase or prior to the purchase, so they can actually make the repairs and get into that house.
Not after purchase, prior to purchase.
Prior to purchase, yes.
With purchase.
Yeah, so for instance, the appraisal's done or a building inspection is done. I mean, Paul, how many deals do you see fall apart because of the building inspection?
Half.
It happens all the time. And some of them, folks are walking away from these deals because they want this or that repair made. And it's not necessarily going to kill the deal with the bank, but for those first-time home buyers, those deals are getting killed because of they can't get financing because of the quality of the house. So something's got to be repaired, and they're not necessarily big things. It could be $2,500 in repairs, but the repair needs to be made prior to the closing because you're not going to get an investor who's going to close on that house in the current condition.
Okay.
So that's what we really need.
Interesting. Okay. Great. Chris?
Just one thing in defense of towns, I hear a lot about towns should do this and towns should do that. I don't know how much more we can expect volunteer select boards to do. Larger towns with staff may be able to do more, but just speaking select boards, administration of everything has become so complex. It's very difficult for them to manage. You know, it's getting even more difficult to make the decision about whether you buy the new dump truck or refurbish it. Mm-hmm. So the model I'd like to point to is like Friends of Algiers Village. You know, sometimes it can be citizen organizations that can be much more flexible, move much more nimbly than expecting a select board to do it. And so like Friends of Algiers Village, they were largely responsible, working with the select board, working with Windsor Housing Trust, working with the town of Brattleboro to extend wastewater. I mean, that can be a better part of the solution than saying, why isn't the town doing X, Y, or Z? Because the towns can plan things to death, but they're not necessarily going to have the capacity to actually do the work. And going back to a quick point to what Bob was saying on the income issue, on the economic issue. I mean, one of the things, as I recall from our data in Windham County, is a lot of the income in the county is not earned. Right. It is coming in from pensions or investments or other things. And a lot of those people, frankly, sit on select boards or commissioners or other things, and their economic well-being has nothing to do with the economy in this region. Right. They are fine no matter what happens here. It may be an inconvenience if the restaurant shuts down because there's not enough patronage or something, but generally speaking, they're insulated from it. We've got to figure out more of a way to get people who actually are dependent on the local economies into decision-making positions about what the future of the towns are going forward. I know, you know, in some cases, frankly, too, the ages are getting up there. You see it in the data. And honestly, and this is not meant to be disparaging at all, I think it's reality, your planning horizon, if you're 75, is different than your planning horizon if you're 20. And I just hit 50. I mean, I know my planning horizon is different, and my outlook on the world looks very different than it did when I was 25 years old. And so I think it's just natural. We've got to get more and younger people on these boards, and that means also maybe sometimes structuring them and having meetings in ways that are different to where they can actually participate. And I didn't mean to go too deep, but it's a fundamental issue that we see.
You have a closing comment from Bob?
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on that. We talked before about what can towns do, what assets do you have. Chris sort of touched on one of the assets are your own people. If you have high equity people, the truth of the matter is that private sector is not going to sort of help revitalize your town because it doesn't make any economic sense. I've seen towns, why doesn't somebody come in and fix that building? Nobody's going to come. At the end of the day, it's like you have to do it yourself. And if you have people in the community that care about your community and you can sort of bring them together, that's a great asset. And Algiers is a case, Bennington is a case, where people are stepping up and saying, yeah, I know there's no return, but I'm willing to sort of take risks and put equity in this to try to make a difference. So that is, you know, a strategy that towns can use.
Can I make one comment? Follow up on Chris's comment.
Yeah, it's up to Sarah.
Yeah. Okay. So I am on the board of the Friends of Algiers Village. B, I'm on the Guilford Select Board. And so we don't have a housing problem per se in Algiers Village unless we don't have enough senior housing because of all of the support that we've got from the community and Wyndham Regional Commission and state and stuff like that, Wyndham Housing Trust. What we have and what has not been touched on in this discussion at all is a lot of homeowners or property owners who are either older or who can no longer afford the properties that they own, and they want to move to a different kind of housing, and we don't have in Guilford the possibility of the younger population who want to move to Guilford to come in and buy. And so I'm not hearing these, you know, anything that addresses the single housing units other than maybe what you're talking about in terms of a loan to repair.
Yeah.
And so you can talk about the dense urban, even the rural Friends of Algiers Village, but our Guilford community, which has 900 properties spread around a huge amount of acreage, doesn't have enough. We have no solution we're not dealing with that solution, any solutions.
And they have to be able to fix up their home in order to pass the inspection and sell it, so. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
Great, thank you. Thank you to our panel. We're going to take about a 10-minute break, coffee, bathroom. If you're in the last section, you brought handouts. If you could just put it on this table here.
All right, that was a great panel. Thank you guys for sticking with it. We've got 2 more things for the rest of the afternoon. I do want to note that this is being recorded, so we will have it on YouTube. I'll send it out if you want to, rewatch it 5 times or share it with people who weren't able to be here. Next, we're going to have Bill Colvin. He's with the Bennington County Regional Commission and the Bennington County Industrial Corporation, and he's going to talk about the importance of partnerships.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. I don't know where the presentation was.
I don't know either. You talk, I'll figure it out.
Okay. Thanks very much, Sarah. Thanks everyone for attending this afternoon. Sarah invited me to come and talk about the importance of partnerships. I think what we've heard so far today is that doing this type of development, housing, mixed use, whatever we're doing in our communities is a heavy lift. One of the ways to help get over those challenges is through some creative partnerships. A couple of other themes have evolved today, I think, which we can weave through here, which is also the importance of planning and the importance of what municipal roles are in this process. So in order to do that, I want to highlight 2 kind of creative projects that are happening in the Bennington region. One is the Putnam Block redevelopment. The other is a project through the medical system called Healthy Homes for Bennington. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Putnam project. New news this morning in the banner, hoping to launch phase 1 of this redevelopment in May or June of this year. This has really been a kind of overnight sensation, which has been 40 years in the making to get to this project up and running. So regarding planning, this process at least indirectly started in 2013 with the creation of the first ever strategic economic development plan for the town of Bennington. That plan resulted in a comprehensive process bringing together stakeholders from around the town looking at the economic future of the community and came up with a series of 40 strategic recommendations for moving Bennington's economy forward. The top 10 of those were highlighted, and on here, although you probably can't read it, number 9 was find funding to develop a Bennington downtown area-wide plan looking at opportunities to redevelop, in particular, brownfields sites in the community. So we often get the push in the planning profession that all you do is plan, 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 plan. What I want to suggest today is planning with follow-through really is a critical piece of these partnerships. So that was one of the strategic recommendations in the Bennington Economic Development Plan, and it led to the development of funding through Vermont DEC and through the Agency of Commerce and Community Development municipal planning grant with the creation of the Bennington Downtown Area-Wide Plan, which was released in January 2016. That plan looked at a review of the existing conditions within the community, had a market study, selected some key sites for redevelopment, and did some conceptual redevelopment scenarios, which, as it worked out, were primarily sited around what was then known as the Greenberg properties or the Putnam blocks, 4 acres in the heart of downtown Bennington, basically the entire southwest quadrant of Bennington's downtown. Then went on and did some feasibility analyses and created an implementation plan for some of these efforts. This is an example of some of the redevelopment scenarios that were created in the area-wide plan, and it came up with a number of key recommendations. Among them, bring residential first as an activator for redeveloping and revitalizing the downtown. Get people living in and about the downtown. Look to extend your downtown from what is now a 8 or 9 hour downtown to a 12 to 15 hour downtown. And the key to doing that, get people living in the heart of the community at a variety of income levels. So residential is an activator, commercial space will follow, and we know retail in this environment is really difficult. But you do the first 2, retail has an opportunity to be successful. So those were the recommendations of the plan. This comes in an environment, we've heard a lot of the economic and demographic challenges being faced, shrinking population in southern Vermont, an aging population, tourism revenues that are rebounding more slowly than elsewhere in the state, as well as retail sales that have not caught up to other places in the state. So this is the environment in which this planning was taking place. At the same time, there was a group of institutional and business leaders coming around to figure out what can the private sector do to help move Bennington's economy forward. A recognition, if you will, that this is not a public sector responsibility and that we all kind of have a role in moving our local economy forward. So they realized the need to act. They realized that nobody's going to ride in from the outside to save Bennington. And they really decided that that action needed to be of a significant enough scale to make an economic difference in the community. So we had this planning process. We had a group of committed private sector individuals who wanted to step up and take a role in the local economy. And you had 4 acres in the heart of your community in basically single ownership, all available at the same time. So those 3 things came together to lead to what is now the Putnam Block redevelopment. And up here, you're looking at some of the partners who, to date, have been involved in that effort, either as investors, as anchor tenants, as both in the case of the college and the medical system, and as well as our public sector partners. EPA funding has been sought to do the phase 1 and phase 2 environmental site assessments. Funding has been sought through the state of Vermont. We received federal funding for a community development block grant and the like. But this is really the breadth and depth of the partnerships that are involved in this project. So this is the existing site in the heart of downtown Bennington. Again, 4 acres. For those of you familiar, kind of in the upper right-hand corner is where the clock is, at the heart of Route 7 and Route 9 at People's Bank. Everything in that southwest corner. Now, most of these 4 acres in the heart of downtown, 90% vacant currently, and there have been no active upper floor uses in any of these buildings since the late 1970s. So 40 years really of continuing decline. You heard Bob Stevens talk about the Brooks House redevelopment in Brattleboro, and that came about, again, similarly with community-minded people stepping up and realizing we need to do something about our downtown. I think the trigger there was a fire, which in many ways is a much, while tragic, much easier thing to rally around. It's a physical sign of this is a hole in our downtown. I think 40 years of kind of ongoing and continuing decline is a little more difficult to rally people around and get a real sense of urgency. And this is what's planned for the site. We got about $2 million of environmental site assessment to take care of. 73,000 square feet of historic renovation of the historic structures, about 94,000 square feet of new construction in 2 buildings with a 3rd building to be determined, and a variety of uses, medical offices, 50 to 70 residential units, cafe, restaurant, grocery store, and a variety of other commercial uses, including Bennington College's development office, Southwest Vermont Medical Care will have some offices in the downtown, and a number of other retail uses. So pretty ambitious plan. Total right now, phase 1 and phase 2, closing in on about $55 million. And that's what the site would look like after the fact. The rendering. Looking from, this is where the mobile station is currently. If you're trying to get situated in downtown Bennington, again, the 4 corners would be in the upper left-hand corner in this particular instance. So we've heard a lot about kind of municipal involvement, municipal roles. Chris made an excellent point about the size of the municipality often dictates what those roles might be. Bennington, being a larger municipality, has stepped up to play an integral role, really completing that public-private partnership with the public component. So Bennington sponsored the municipal planning grant, again, which was the Bennington Downtown Area-Wide Plan. The town of Bennington has been the sponsor for the Vermont Community Development Program $1 Million Block Grant, which is federal funding, which flows through the state, has to come to a municipality. So the town of Bennington is the grant recipient there and then is passing that on to the project. The town of Bennington just received the first of the new tax increment financing districts in the state. 6 new districts, the opportunity for 6 new districts were approved with the last legislative session. Bennington was ready to pull the trigger based upon The increment that will be created in phase 1 of the Putnam block, the tax increment financing district will potentially benefit phase 2 of the Putnam block with doing some public infrastructure. The town sponsors downtown tax credits through the state's designated downtown program to the tune of about just under $700,000 so far. We'll have a second application this June for about another $500,000 for phase 1. There's a possibility for tax stabilization moving forward. The town has committed a $200,000 revolving loan to the program, and most importantly, the town select board, the administration, and a huge swath of the community is out there talking about the importance of this project and advocating for it going forward. So, it takes a lot of creative partnerships to do a project like this in communities like ours. I think this is a really interesting example of the public sector and private sector coming together, rowing in the same direction to try to create a positive change for the community. One other project and planning related that I wanted to talk about, another creative partnership opportunity that we're really proud of in this community, is the Healthy Homes program run through Southwest Vermont Medical Center. Interestingly, again, one of the recommendations in the Bennington Strategic Economic Development Plan was to develop a housing study, kind of looked at creating the future housing, meeting the future housing needs of a community that Bennington envisioned itself to be in the future. Traditional housing studies kind of look at supply, look at demand, and figure out where the gap is in between. This was a more aspirational study to look at what are some of the things that the community could do to create a housing environment that it aspired to be. So that was really the goal of it. And one of the strategic recommendations, there were 5 strategic recommendations of this housing plan, but one of them was to work with area employers to encourage employees to live in Bennington. As part of this process, there were folks involved from Southwest Vermont Medical Center in the housing study, and that led to a series of discussions with Tom D. and other leaders at the medical system, which ultimately led to this development of Healthy Homes for Bennington. Through this program, the medical system is working with the town to identify distressed properties in a key neighborhood sector just to the northeast of downtown Bennington. It's about a 6-block square of older homes, mixed single-family and multifamily homes, and a number of them are in various stages of distress, some foreclosures, some long-deferred maintenance, and the like. So the medical system reached out to the community and the town to help identify a number of homes in this sector that might be available. And what the medical system has done through a commitment of its board to try to acquire 3 properties per year for each of the next 5 years is acquiring these properties. The medical system is then investing to improve them to a high quality home, and then assisting employees at the medical system with the down payment requirement to get them into the home. So the challenge we just heard about, where's that money where's the money available to fix up kind of this older aging housing stock? The medical system is actually stepping up, doing that heavy lift, acquiring the property, fixing it up, and then the other hard part, assisting with the down payment for qualified employees at its home. Hale Resources, John Hale and Zach and their crew actually did this first project, so we have cut the ribbon, and there's a family living on this almost a year now ago. This house is on Park Street. You see a before and after photo. Interior, that's the kitchen before, the kitchen after. And in this particular case, both of these folks were employed for an extended period of time at the medical system and actually just had a young child. So it was a great opportunity through a partnership with Southwest Vermont Healthcare. The Bank of Bennington has stepped up to be aggressive in its lending, and the town of Bennington to create a really, I think, a model program for employers around the state. And really, these are the goals of the Healthy Home for Bennington project, to provide affordable opportunities for home ownership, assisting with the recruitment and retention of qualified workforce. That's the very same reason that the medical system and the colleges are involved in the Putnam Project. They recognize it a vital downtown and having places for folks coming to the community to live at a variety of price points is integral to their recruitment efforts. Supports community development efforts and local investments, establishing a stable and supportive environment to improve the health of Bennington families. The medical system recognizes that having a quality, safe place to live is one of the key components of community health, and boosting the local economy by employing local contractors to perform the renovations to distressed downtown homes. This is a really creative partnering model, again, which came about with the support of the community, creative public-private partnerships, and some key planning efforts. Happy to address any questions.
You mentioned going back to the Putnam block, 50
Yeah.
to 70 residential units.
Yes.
What's the mix of rental versus ownership there?
So they're all rental, and that is due in large part to the structure of the financing. As Bob noted earlier, this will cost about $300 a square foot to build. The end value, we know, for example, phase one is going to cost about $25 million. When we cut the ribbon and it's fully occupied, we have an appraisal at $7.5 million. So to backfill that value, again, subsidies that come in the form of new market tax credits, historic tax credits, federal and state. But new market tax credits in particular demand that housing be rental housing, at least for the 7-year compliance period of those new market tax credits.
We're going to have to move on just because
Great.
one of our presenters has to leave soon, but feel free to
Thank
talk
you
to
very
Bill
much.
afterwards.
Thank you, Bill. So our last section for today is about housing programs and tools. We have a variety of people who some you've already heard from, some you haven't, who are going to come down and take 5 to 7 minutes to just give a high-level explanation of some of those tools and programs out there for municipalities. So we're going to have Jen Holler of VHCB come talk about the housing bond.
One at a time? So we mentioned it a few times earlier today. There's been an initiative that Governor Scott proposed last year, and it's a Housing for All revenue bond. He proposed it, and the legislature pretty quickly endorsed it, and there was a lot of support across all three parties in the State House. There was some back and forth wrangling between the Democrats in the legislature and Governor Scott around how exactly it was going to get paid for. They were hoping, frankly, to try to box them into raising some revenue. And in the end, they worked it out. And the bond really, it's really a mechanism. The bond itself is a mechanism for how the state is going to raise additional funding to make it available for housing development across the state. So what they did is they dedicated $2.5 million every year for the next 20 from the revenue that's received from the property transfer tax, and said, we'll make that much available for debt service on a bond. That amount of money actually is going to be offset, because that means there's less money for the state to pay elsewhere, with $1.5 million that comes out of our budget every year, and then $1.5 million that comes out of another property transfer tax surcharge. So the estimates had been that with that amount of debt service, you could raise about $35 million, and that's the $35 million bond you may have heard about. So that was passed and became law at the end of June. And after that, the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, which will administer the program, we did a series of outreach meetings and met some of you there. We did 6 meetings around the state. We've been reviewing a steady stream of applications. The bond, you might have heard in the news yesterday that the bond itself actually went out to market and had an even better result than expected. So that was pretty exciting. So that's actually going to bring in $37 million, and all that's going to go into projects or developments around the state. So that's really good news. We knew that was going to happen. We didn't know exactly how much the bond would raise, but we knew it was going to raise somewhere more than $30 million. So we've already started reviewing applications and making funding commitments. So actually, as of the end of December, we had committed $9.5 million of what will be available through that Housing for All initiative to 11 projects in 10 communities in 5 counties around the state, comprising 310 units, and several of those projects are already under construction, and some of those are in Bennington and Windham County. So, for example, the Windham and Windsor Trust's Great River Terrace project had received funding from the bond, as well as the Putney Landing project. Both of those are under construction now. The East Branch homeownership development that Stephanie mentioned earlier is getting some funding from the bond proceeds. There have been pretty serious conversations around the Putnam block about whether or not the bond can help create some of those 80 to 120 units there, because that's really what the community is hoping for in that location, and there aren't other sources that are available for that. So all those things are happening, and then there are a number of projects in other parts of the state that are underway now. So essentially what the bond will do, those $37 million will flow through the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board. We will making it all available to projects. So developers come to us and apply for those. We review them, underwrite them much as a bank would. We get pretty involved in the design sometimes and apply lessons that VHCB has learned over the years around what can make a housing development really last and serve its people well over time. And so there's that back and forth, and then our staff make recommendations to our board, which is a publicly appointed board, and they make the final funding recommendations. So essentially the funding is for the development or rehabilitation of either multifamily or single-family homes. As we've mentioned many times, it has a broader range of eligibility, up to 120% of area median income. And the goals for the bond were really around helping to alleviate the housing crunch. So the emphasis or priority is around creating new units or bringing units that are substandard back into service and useful life. So really the emphasis is on creating new housing opportunities. Let's see, what else should I add? Oh, the statute, the legislature, and the requires that 25% of the homes that are created through the this funding source will be affordable to very low-income Vermonters. So those with 50% of the area median or low, and at least 25% of the homes created will be in that middle income range between 80 and 120, and the rest will go to wherever the community needs are and the projects are that come forward. Another big emphasis for this has been around public and private partnerships. So this actually keys off of what Bill was talking about pretty well. That several of the biggest projects that have happened already are as the result of a collaboration between private and nonprofit developers. In some instances, those are turnkey situations where a private developer will basically construct and then turn the project over to a nonprofit to manage and own and steward over time. And in other instances, it's a mix of public and private, or nonprofit and private ownership within the same housing development. So for instance, you may have heard about the Cambrian Rise project, which is on the former Burlington College site in the new north end of Burlington, and that is a range of home ownership, multifamily housing. There are homes that are going to be available to people who are homeless with services. There are also going to be some really high-end luxury condos. Those are going to be the ones with the view of the lake. And there are 2 housing nonprofits, one of whom does senior housing actually, and the other Champlain Housing Trust, which is Windham and Windsor's and Shire's counterpart in that part of the state, and they're working with a private developer, Eric Farrell, to make that happen. So Farrell's going to develop some, and already has some, market rate units, and then he will sell some of the property and has agreements with these nonprofits who are going to bring in housing at different affordability levels. So it's going to be pretty exciting. There's going to be a broad range. It's going to be intergenerational, mixed income, and because the Housing and Conservation Board is about housing and conservation, we have 2 missions. We're really excited about that one because it involves 12 acres of conserved land right on the waterfront. So you're going to have people with all means that are able to walk right down to the Lake Champlain and enjoy enjoy that tremendous asset. So I am going to leave with you an overview of the projects that's been funded so far, and also the more geeky guidelines for use of the Housing Revenue Bond funds. Essentially, it's an additional funding stream that flows through the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board. And so you can, and also leave a few cards because I've got to hit the road back up to Montpelier. One other key point. So this funding will go out over 3 years. So essentially, we've kind of completed the first year with that first $9.5 million. We have a steady stream of applications coming into us right now, and we've had to say no to some just because we're committed to trying to phase it and doing it over 3 years. So at this point, it looks like, and that third year will be 2019. The other big consideration for this is geographic distribution, and I have to honestly say, as exciting as this opportunity has been as an organization to make available to communities, one of the biggest challenges we face is ensuring that geographic distribution. So if you all could really fire up some good projects and bring them to us, that would be great, because there's a whole lot of people in Chittenden County who want this money, and they're knocking on our door. So I'll leave it with that unless there are any quick questions. Yeah.
Jen, is there any way to make that available to a little bit more than 120% of median?
No, it's in statute. And we know there's a need even higher than that. Honestly, it was a kind of a reach for some of the people in the legislature who feel like if you're going to put public funding into something, it needs to go to the most needy. So it was a little bit of stretch for folks to get up to 120, and I don't really see it going beyond that at this point.
Jen, what's the policy on a nonprofit buying a property, having it renovated, and selling it to a for-profit company for stewardship?
Oh, that's a really interesting scenario. So part of what comes along with this, and this is something that we're kind of figuring out, working through as we go on the 80 to 120 range, haven't had that situation come up. But when the Housing Conservation Board invests in something, it's a state investment that is meant to be protected over time. So if there's an investment in that property and that certain affordability levels are achieved, it's always been the policy that essentially those be locked in over time, so to the gentrification point that came up earlier, so you do really well, you create 80 to 120 units, and all of a sudden the downtown goes crazy and people think they can rent them for higher rates. We want to be sure that they stay there. So there's a covenant that comes along with that.
I understand that.
So most often the nonprofit are used to dealing with those covenants, so they're usually ones that own and steward those properties over time. But that's something we're figuring out. And also there's about $3.4 million that we're making available in an innovation pot of money that we want to try new models in. So there are going to be new ways of doing things that we haven't explored, and we want to try to see what those are.
Even if that for-profit company sticks to the requirements of the 80 to 120,
yep.
I mean, they're still doing the same thing. It's perpetual with the property, but the company's for-profit company's managing it.
Yeah, if there's a way that they could agree to the covenants over time and the stewardship. Right now, through statute, the only eligible applicants are nonprofits or municipalities, so that was something you'd have to figure out.
Property, and then they sell it to a for-profit company that stewardships the property. I mean, it's still qualified and still doing the same exact thing, but a for-profit company.
So we ought to take a look at that.
Okay.
We really have. We haven't had that particular scenario brought to us, so.
It was just brought to you.
All right, and I wish I had our general counsel, so.
Thank you, Jen. Jen's gonna leave her cards since she has to leave.
Can I get one of those?
Next, we're gonna have Chris Campany of Wyndham Regional.
Yeah, you too.
So greetings. You've already heard a lot from me already. So regional planning commissions, in the absence of county government, and there is no county government in Vermont, we serve as a link between local, state, and federal governments. And we are political subdivisions in the state. We are comprised of appointed commissioners by the towns. In our case, we also have what are called citizen interest commissioners, but that's how we're governed. Our counterpart in Bennington County is the Bennington County Regional Commission. Jim Sullivan is my counterpart, and you've already heard from Bill. Some of the more obvious things that we do, we of course develop regional plans which establish regional policies. Regional commissions, we participate, we have standing in Act 250 proceedings, but we don't issue any permits, and ultimately our policies are interpreted through whatever the state permitting authority is. I mean, typically it's Act 250, one of the district environmental commissions, but we also participate in the Section 248 energy processes, and then sometimes federal. But a lot of what we do is provide assistance to towns with their town planning, in both directly helping them, providing technical assistance as their planning commissions develop plans, and then sometimes just helping them make sense of different state policies and programs. You know, a lot of towns don't have the capacity, or even the larger towns like a Bennington or a Brattleboro, oftentimes don't have the administrative capacity that they need, so we can kind of help expand that bandwidth. But we help towns with their planning. We often provide support to towns as they develop applications for different especially state, sometimes federal, and sometimes nonprofit grant applications. Typically the towns will actually do a lot of the writing, but we'll provide the technical support. We have helped actually develop the grants for things like community development block grants, but those cost us about $10,000 to develop as far as the staff time that goes into that. And so typically we'll help when we've talked with the state, and it seems like that project, whatever it is, has a good likelihood of being funded, so the funding can be recouped through the grant process. But you can imagine, I mean, if as challenging as it can be for us, sometimes applying for something like a community development block grant may be impossible for a town to apply for. And then also administer. We do help towns oftentimes administer programs, whether it's transportation or community development block grant. Sometimes we are called upon to help facilitate discussions both within and among town commissions and boards. In some cases, we've even been like when you have a planning commission who's found it difficult to work with a select board, sometimes we'll come in as just the neutral facilitator. We also have, Wyndham Regional Commission has a brownfields program, and we have a revolving loan fund. Bill mentioned that earlier. We're actually considering, it goes before our exec board next week, providing assistance for the Putnam block. We've also assisted with the dam down in Pownell, but most of our focus has been in the Wyndham region, and projects that we provided support for. We're among the partners, like with the development of the co-op and housing project, Algiers Village, the development of the housing there, New England Youth Theater, the Main Street Arts Project in Saxons River. So we help administer the region's brownfield programs. This is a finite resource. It's fairly unique to us, but we have funding through the Clean Energy Development Fund that came about through the Vermont Yankee settlement, to where we're able to, we have a Wyndham Modern Wood Heat program. We're helping schools and then other public buildings and nonprofits transition over to wood heat. Sometimes this is a duplicate boiler program. Then we also had a grant program for renewable energy generation. And again, this was going to some businesses. Also, so like Allard Lumber, they had a co-generating facility where they were both using some of their wood product to create heat, to generate electricity, but also dry their wood. But also one of the projects we funded was Wyndham Windsor Housing Trust, putting solar on the project on Putney Road. I'm skipping Lamplighter project?
Great River Terrace.
Great River Terrace. So that, I would like to think that to the extent that the state gets additional funding for those kinds of projects, we've been a good model for them to provide funding to other RPCs to support those kinds of grants. And then we also facilitate contacts with agencies and organizations. Oftentimes towns will contact us to say, how do we get this dealt with, or how do we get questions answered? And then there's the advocacy piece, like you've heard me go on a lot about village water and wastewater, so we'll advocate at the state level about what we feel policy should be And then we also, not necessarily speak for the towns, but kind of speak on their behalf when we realize that some policies coming down is going to be burdensome to them. We try to communicate to the legislature and the governor and the state agencies when they're promulgating rules. So that's kind of us in a nutshell. And if you have any questions, I'm around.
We'll next hear from Peter and Stephanie. I'll just call you both up, if that's okay. You heard from them earlier today. They'll just give a little overview for you.
So I talked a lot about the rental market and the rental development opportunities that Windham and Windsor Housing Trust has, but we also have a home ownership center, which has a few programs that I'll talk about specifically. We have a new one this year through the Clean Energy Development Fund. These are for individual homeowners to replace old wood stoves with new modern pellet stoves, which they provide financial assistance, stove disposal, to allow that transition to hopefully a more modern, safer, cleaner stove. We also have our Green Mountain Home Repair Program, which kind of goes towards what does a single family homeowner do when they need to make these necessary home repairs. Rather than defer the maintenance 10, 20 years down the line, we offer affordable loans. They are income restricted, but they're available for health issues, structural issues, failing mechanical systems, septic issues, water issues like either treatment or to drill a new well. So we do offer options for single-family homeowners to help fix up properties, and I also believe now there is funding through this program for owner-occupied rental properties also. So if somebody owns and lives in a duplex, they can help fix up their rental property as well. Which and then. With that comes income restrictions on the rental. And then we also have our home buyer education program, which, like I said before, a lot of times is required by certain lenders, but it also has a lot of valuable information for new homeowners. And it also comes with, I believe it is 1 year of counseling. So there are opportunities out there for homeowners in your communities who might need some assistance either repair or just to modernize their home, as well as opportunities for new prospective homeowners. And then also, if you from the rental side, if you happen to have a 2-acre parcel which was prime for 18 to 20 units of development, we love doing new construction in these towns. So I'll pass it over to Stephanie.
So Shires is not as much of a service-based organization as Windham Windsor Housing Trust, but we do have some programs outside of our typical development and rental and property management. Here in Bennington, we have some state tax credits available for down payment assistance, specifically for the Jenningsburg condominium project, and we do still have some down payment assistance available for that. And we've placed 3 families in that particular development and made it more affordable for them and made that payment something that was more manageable for them and sustainable. Also, we have the SASH program, which I think a lot of people aren't familiar with, and that's the Support and Services at Home program. And we have 4.5 panels or 450 participants. We have 1.5 in Deerfield Valley, which is not really our service area, but it's an underserved part of the state, and we have brought the program there. And the other panels we have 1 panel in Manchester, and the rest are in Bennington. And what the program does is it keeps Medicare recipients in their homes for as long as possible. When they would choose to stay at home, it provides connection to resources. It started off based in housing and has grown and grown. It's being replicated nationwide now. And we have found it to be a very successful program. What we've seen in the first 6 years is that it saves approximately $1,300 in Medicare spending each year for each participant who is involved. So this is a program, we have 5 dedicated employees strictly for the SASH program. So I think a lot of folks don't realize that we have this available, and it's been a great success. And we also partner with local not-for-profits who come to us with ideas and who want to do some development or would like, who have a project in mind and just don't have the development capacity. So we're working with a couple of partner not-for-profit agencies right now on some ideas and hoping to help them move their vision forward with our development department. And also we partner locally with NeighborWorks, most recently on a home maintenance program that we're going to be helping to sponsor in the area, and we think will be a great success. So we'd like to support that and their home buyer education classes as well. And that's it for us.
Peter has some handouts there that he'll put down on the table. Next, we're going to hear from Alex. Alex is with the USDA Rural Development, and they do other things besides agriculture, like housing. So here he is.
So I'm Alex with the USDA Rural Development. I've been with the agency for 3 years, and I am a loan assistant trained to become a loan specialist. We have Megan, who is a loan specialist up there, and we have Polly, who is our public affairs coordinator. Like Sarah said, I'm not a meat inspector. We're the financial arm of the USDA. So we build thriving communities, and we try to sustain those communities through economic development. What does that mean? Well, we try to build capacity and stability with our 40+ programs that we offer. I have an all programs guide on the table. The most important thing that you will take away from me is that guide. It has all our programs, it has our website, phone numbers. So if you have anything that we may touch upon, get in contact with us. So our 40 programs are broken down into basically 3 umbrella categories. We have our housing programs, we have our business programs, and our community programs. Between those 3 programs, we have a portfolio of approximately $222 billion in loans, with housing being about half of that. If you need something for a wastewater facility, we can help you with that. If you have a need for a fire truck in town, we can help you with that. And if you're looking to build infrastructure, if you need equipment for a hospital, as you guessed, we can help you with that. So as much as I love all our programs, I'm a housing person. Housing is really important because it's where the workforce and every member of our great communities rest their head at night. So it's not only important to have safe, sanitary, and an affordable place for everyone to call their home, but it's important that everyone takes pride in where they rest their head at night. And that's where we come in. We have single-family and multifamily programs. Our multifamily program's goal is to provide affordable rental housing. We do that through direct loans, loan guarantees, and rental assistance. Our single-family guaranteed loan is a no down payment loan. It's a lower interest rate than what traditional banks will offer. It's for moderate and above moderate income people, and it's a 30-year 1% fee at closing, and there's a 0.35% annual fee of the principal that we charge as well. And we can go up to the appraised value of the house. So meaning we can roll closing costs into the guaranteed loan. And so this program is through the bank. So it's mostly their requirements and regulations that they follow. We have our single family home direct program. This is for those who are low and very low. It is, again, no down payment, 3.25% fixed rate, and with subsidy, the interest rate can be lowered to 1%. We can term it out to 33 or 38 years, so we can make it more affordable for people because we can term it out longer. And again, we can loan up to the appraised value of the home. We also can do a refinance. So if someone has a current loan with a bank and they need major repairs to the home, they can come to us. We can refinance, pay off their past debt, and roll the repairs into their new loan with us. And we also have a home repair program. And so the home repair program that we have has two components. We have a loan and a grant. This program is for those who are very low. The grant is for those who are 62 years or older and up to a $7,500 lifetime grant. So if someone needs new windows and they get a $1,000 grant through us, they still have $6,500 to spend. And that's non-repayable as long as the house does not change title within 3 years. We have a loan that is up to a $20,000 loan, up to 20 years, and it's a 1% loan. So to put that into perspective, for every $1,000 someone borrows, it's a $4.60 payment a month. And so if someone borrows $5,000, $23 a month for the repairs. And we just actually had a change in this program, whereas before people used to come to us looking for either just a grant or a loan, whatever it may be. Now we do it by ratios. So if someone is very low, then it would appear that they could qualify for just a grant. If they're in between, they could get a loan and grant. Or if it's someone with on the higher income side with not much debt, then we would look at them for a loan. So with that said, thank you for your time, and do you guys have any questions? Yes.
That 20,000 you just mentioned is, oh, you said 20-year term?
Yes.
Okay.
Awesome. Thank you, guys.
Next, we're going to hear from Bob Stevens, who we heard from earlier, but he's going to talk about all that complicated stuff.
Thanks. I guess I get to cover everything else. And it is a long list, but maybe to back up for context, what I was saying earlier about the gap between cost and value, I'm going to do a quick run through of potential tools, funding sources, and I'm going to put them in two categories. One is money you don't have to pay back, and then debt, money you do have to pay back. Because clearly for some of these projects, to make them happen, you have to have some money you don't have to pay back. Unfortunately, that money comes with other, well, not unfortunately, there are programs available. It comes with complexity. It comes with other goals that have to be met, and I'll sort of touch on the highlights. And then if you think any of this is applicable, happy to talk afterwards. So the big ones for us are new market tax credits. New market tax credits are a job creation program through the federal government for qualified census tracts. So only census tracts in the country that meet certain low-income characteristics are eligible for that, and we have several of them. We are poor in southern Vermont, so we have a few of those districts around. Those projects, suffice to say, we use them pretty frequently for industrial projects, large projects like the Putnam project qualify, the Brooks House qualifies. But in general, you need to be $5 to $10 million to make the transactional cost worthwhile. And so I won't spend a lot of time. If there's something that sort of fits into that, it is a tool that's appropriate in some cases. But for the most part, you're going to trigger either BCIC or BDCC or somebody like us to kind of help you through that. The federal historic tax credit is available for commercial properties and for-profit entities for any property that is historic. So that's one that's not separated out into census tracts. It is for preservation around certain guidelines. The trick with that is monetizing it. I mean, we have plenty of clients who have qualified, nonprofit clients, that can get a tax credit, but they're a nonprofit, they can't use that tax. Even private sector, somewhat difficult to monetize it. It has its level of complexity. Again, if you're a one-time nonprofit, one-time sort of project through, it's not going to be a lot of value. If you are, John might be able to use this for his own tax liability. It's a good tool. It can be up to 20% of the project cost, so it's significant. It's a significant benefit. If you're renovating historic properties, you have to jump through some hoops to get it, but it is a very good tool. The state, we call them state historic tax credits, or the downtown tax credits for designated downtowns, is a great program, fairly easy to get, easy to monetize. You have to be in the right district, a qualified designated downtown or village. It is competitive. It maxes out per community for our projects, around $650,000. But first one I got was for my office building for $80,000, and it was that right? No, $40,000 for that building. So it's a great tool, and it's fairly easy to monetize that in Vermont. They did it right as opposed to the federal government tax credits. I won't talk about low-income housing tax credits. That's really if you have a project that's eligible, talk to Stephanie or Peter. They do those things, and pretty much the only people who can access those funds in Vermont are the affordable housing developers who really manage that exceedingly well. A couple of times tonight we've talked about community development block grants. It's a tool that's available to all towns. As Chris said, it's complicated to go and get that and to qualify and to monitor it, but it can be, typically the maximum grant is about $750,000. It's a great tool. You don't have to pay that back. We've had projects where we've hit $1 million in some cases. So it is a tool. It's a little painful, to be honest with you, but it is a great tool for something that fits into that category. And then Chris also talked about the Brownsfield program, and that's the bulk of sources that can help sort of close a gap that you don't have the economy, if you will, does not pay you enough revenue to pay back debt. On the debt side, there are, or equity side, there are a number of different ways to sort of fill that gap, depending on whether you have some job creation along with the housing. And again, you can kind of blend these things together. USDA Rural Development actually has some great loan programs that we've used for facility loans for nonprofits. If you have a nonprofit that mixed in, you've heard some of the sort of good terms, some complexity with that as well. But conventional lending is almost always a piece of this. It's within the context of underwriting and appraised value. VITA has a great loan program that we generally use for mezzanine financing. We can go up to 90% of value for VITA funds. And then there are other funding sources that I'll just touch on that also have transactional and complexity, but can be quite large. So the EB-5, if you've heard about that through Mount Snow, EB-5 is a program, that is debt. You have to pay it back, actually. Talk to the folks up around Jay Peak. They try to not pay it back. It's just, it comes in as equity. It looks like equity, but they are expecting to get that paid back. We do see and believe, although we don't see a lot of this, that there is a role for private equity. There isn't a lot of return on investment in development in Vermont, but there are targeted equity funds that are growing around the country in great forms. There's something called an opportunity zone that the federal government through the tax reform law has put in place that makes an equity investment in qualified census tracts, again, a little more favorable. Again, not to go into those details, but there may be an incentive for people to take a tax gain and reinvest it and have some tax savings as an impetus, again, for projects that might get something off the ground. Bill mentioned earlier TIF, the tax incremental finance. A few towns, Bennington is putting this in place. It's a great source that gets paid back through the increase in tax generated by a project. So as a municipality, again, a lot of complexity, a lot of work to put that in place. But once you have that in place as a town, it might be a tool to perhaps make a difference in the end. So I'll stop there. Windham County's got a couple of other programs through the VY fund, but that's kind of an overview. We find that a lot of these sources really need a project of scale. There's a lot of transactional costs, there's a lot of complexity, but again, and it takes in some ways a village to do these projects. If you find something, really the only thing to mention it here is to be aware that these programs are there, and then to reach out to your regional partners. The development corporations know about most of these programs. They'll bring in other folks. Regional planning commissions know about a lot of them. The state is a great resource. So it's a community out there that knows how to capitalize on this if you have something that's eligible. So just be aware, and if you think that something makes sense, start having that conversation, and we'll sort whether some of those can be useful. So, thanks.
And Sarah, while you walk up, just real quick on the brownfields program, before you make a transaction on a property that may have hazardous materials or petroleum contamination, that's everything from asbestos to pipe coatings to wall coat. It varies. Talk to somebody about how that transaction may be able to affect your ability to make use of brownfields programs and protections. You're welcome to talk to Susan McMahon, our associate director. But it can make a big difference in that chain of custody and what funds you can access and assessments you can access.
Great, thank you. Sorry there hasn't been time for questions. I just want to get everything in by the 4 p.m. time, and then obviously hang out and talk afterwards. Last but not least, we have Todd Nebraska, Bread Loaf Corporation. He's going to touch on some zoning solutions.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm actually here more in the capacity of a planning commissioner in the town of Manchester. Over the last, 20 months now, Janet? A little more than almost two years. We've been going through a major zoning rewrite in our community. And, in part, it was time after a little over 40 years of having our zoning in place it was time for a major overhaul of our zoning ordinance. And, an example of why is we had pieces of property in town that might sit in a zoning district and have 3 overlay districts on top of it. And, if a developer came in to do a project or even, it was just a little convoluted and needed a major cleanup. But it was also in part a response to the identified need for workforce housing in our community. We've done a number of economic development studies. The most recent one was the NED study, and they all come to the same conclusion that we need somewhere between, say, 300 and 600 workforce housing units in our community, that there's that immediate need for that. I will say that within our community, we've been wrestling for our zoning ordinance purposes with what the definition of workforce housing should be. We understand that there's the traditional definition, or that allows you to get funding, which is 60 to 120% of median income. But more anecdotally, John O'Keefe, our town manager, always uses the example. He goes, if I'm an officer in our police department in town, and my wife is a teacher at MEMS, our elementary school, it's really difficult for them to find housing in our community. So, those two incomes put together certainly don't fall into that 120%. So we're actually, for the definition, again, this is Manchester and this is our community, but we're actually considering defining workforce housing in our zoning ordinance is even 200 to 250% of median, so that we can capture a lot of, our workforce in town. So to concentrate more on some of the changes that are coming down the road, we're almost at the end of the 2-year process. The Planning Commission has had our public hearings, and it's going to be going to the Select Board in March for adoption. But talk about some of the major changes. One is increased residential densities. So currently in the town of Manchester, in the downtown, which people might be familiar with it, kind of where the North Shore bookstore is, up to like where Maple Fields is, the allowable residential densities there are 4 units per acre, which, yeah, that's it, 4 units per acre. So, right, it is crazy. So what we're doing, so in the downtown and in the sewer service district, where we have the infrastructure to allow greater densities, It's gonna increase across the board. In the downtown and the town center, which the town center, the way we talk about it, is kind of our commercial core, it's going to no maximum. So in other words, we're gonna allow residential densities to be driven by, you know, how big the build, you know, the dimensional standards that go along within our ordinance. Then outside of that, we're gonna have an R10 zone, which is still in the sewer service district, and the old R3 is gonna go to R4. So it's gonna tier out a little bit, but everything in the sewer service district is, densities are going up.
So 10 means 10 units per acre.
Yeah, 10 units per acre, sorry, and 4 units per acre is the R4. We're also going to allow, we're planning on allowing for increased building heights in the downtown and the town center. So right now, I think our downtown is a maximum 35 feet and the town center is 30 feet. We're gonna go to 40 feet in both of those areas, which, you know, the premise behind it is that if a developer wants to develop a project and they have to go through putting in the vertical infrastructure, elevators and stair towers to develop that property, if you're gonna do it for 2 floors, it gets a little less cost effective, you know, it's a little more cost effective to go to 3 floors and even a little more cost effective to go to 4 floors. So we're trying to encourage some more densely, you know, taller buildings. We also have an adaptive reuse clause in our ordinance, and the way we're looking at adaptive reuse is, you know, if people are familiar with Manchester, there's a lot of older roadside motels, and we've heard from a lot of those, or a couple of those motel owners that, you know, looking down the road, they'd like to sell, they'd like to retire, and, you know, for better or worse, it's not always, you know, it's not the most attractive business model for everybody. So no matter where those, motels are one, it could be former schools, it could be if someone wanted to develop affordable housing in an, you know, an old dairy barn somewhere and could figure out how to make that work, that you could develop workforce housing in these buildings, or housing that meets the definition of workforce or affordable in these, without being restricted to the densities of the underlying zoning district. So if you had a motel that sits out in the rural residential, which is 1 house per 5 acres, you could still maybe develop 10 or 12 or 15 units in that former motel. And then the last thing that we're doing is across the board, we're giving density bonuses. So, you know, some of those are out in the rural residential or, you know, rural ag zones, where for a certain percentage of land preservation, you can develop more residential units on your property. We've created a couple of mixed use districts around the downtown, and in at least one of those mixed use districts, what we're going to do is, if allow for a taller building, which means more units, if, you know, for one example, if a certain percentage of parking is placed underneath the building. So we're gonna allow for taller buildings and greater density if you take some of the surface parking, which is hard surface, and tuck it under your buildings as opposed to building it next to your buildings. You know, and then we've also been toying with this, but across all of our districts, there will be a net zero bonus for PUDs and PRDs. So planned unit developments and planned residential developments. If you can develop entirely, you know, all of the units in that development as a net zero building or property, there are going to be some density bonuses that you could allow with that. And I can't remember the exact numbers. So those are some of the bigger pieces. And then what we've got coming next is, once we get through this, the Planning Commission's going to take a breath. But then we have started to talk about pursuing the neighborhood development area designation for areas around our downtown to also, you know, there's some incentives in that program that'll hopefully help developers or incentivize developers to develop not just multi-unit residential, but also single-family residential. And from what we heard from Paul earlier, it sounds like everything we're talking about is putting us on the right track if we want to see some more residential development. So that's it. Any questions? I know we're way over the 4.
It's fine, we can end it as a pitch.
Okay, sounds good.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate you hanging out a little past 4. Thanks to Bennington College for letting us use this awesome space. Like I said, this was recorded, so I will send out the YouTube link once we have that uploaded. If there's someone here that you didn't get to talk to, but you want to talk to, but you don't know how to contact them, I'm going to leave my card up here, so just email me, and I can get you in touch with them. And hopefully this sparked some kind of ideas or more questions, and let's just keep the conversation rolling. Thank you.